The summer of 2021 started like any other in Windsor, Wisconsin, a quiet suburb just outside Madison where families barbecued in their backyards and kids played in tree-lined streets. But beneath the surface of this peaceful community, a web of lies was about to unravel in the most shocking way imaginable. What began as a routine missing persons report would expose deception so elaborate, so calculated, that even seasoned investigators couldn't believe what they were uncovering. And at the center of it all was a single piece of digital evidence that would change everything. A screenshot from Snapchat that would reveal the darkest family secret this small town had ever seen. This is the story of how social media became the key to solving one of Wisconsin's most disturbing crimes. How a loving couple's disappearance turned into a nightmare that no parent could ever imagine. And how their own son's digital footprint would ultimately lead investigators straight to the truth. My name is speaking to you from the heart of true crime. And what you're about to hear will shake you to your core. Because sometimes, the people we trust most are the ones capable of the unthinkable. The Halderson family seemed to have it all figured out. Bart and Krista had built a beautiful life together in their Windsor home, complete with everything a middle-class American family could want. 2 sons they adored, stable careers, and a cherished family cabin up north where they could escape the pressures of everyday life. Bart worked as a managing director for an international accounting firm, the kind of guy who wore pressed shirts and kept detailed schedules. Krista balanced him perfectly as the nurturing heart of the family, working in customer service at an auto body shop while pursuing her love of art projects in her spare time. Together, they were the picture of suburban success. Their oldest son, Mitchell, had landed a job in tech and was building his own future. But it was their youngest, 23-year-old Chandler, who seemed to be on the most promising path of all. Still living at home while finishing college, he talked constantly about his internship at an insurance company and couldn't contain his excitement about landing what he claimed was his dream job at SpaceX. Everything seemed perfect. Too perfect, as it would turn out. Friday morning, July 2nd, 2021. Dan Croninger arrived at Zimbrick Body Shop expecting to see his friend and co-worker Krista at her usual spot. But her desk was empty, her computer was off, and there was no note, no message, no explanation for her absence. For anyone else, this might not have raised immediate alarm bells. People call in sick, emergencies happen. But Dan knew Krista better than most. In all the time they'd worked together, she had never simply failed to show up without calling. It wasn't in her nature to leave people hanging, especially not the customers who depended on her. When his calls went straight to voicemail and his text messages remained unanswered, Dan's concern began to grow. Something was wrong. He could feel it in his gut that afternoon, unable to shake his worry. Dan made a decision that would prove crucial to everything that followed. He drove to the Halderson home with his girlfriend, determined to check on his friend. The neighborhood was quiet, exactly as you'd expect on a summer afternoon in Windsor. Manicured lawns, white picket fences, the kind of place where nothing bad was supposed to happen. When they knocked on the front door, silence greeted them. Dan peered through the window and noticed something odd. A coffee table had been knocked over near the fireplace, lying on its side like furniture displaced during some kind of struggle. But maybe it was nothing. Maybe someone had just bumped into it. Walking around to the garage, Dan's confusion deepened. Both of Bart and Krista's cars were sitting in their usual spots. If they had gone somewhere, how did they get there? He was beginning to circle around to the back of the house when the side door opened. Chandler emerged, wrapped in a towel, his hair wet from what he claimed was a recent shower. There was something in his demeanor that struck Dan as off, though he couldn't quite put his finger on what it was. Maybe it was the timing, or maybe it was just the shock of the situation. When Dan asked about his parents, Chandler had an immediate explanation. There had been an emergency at the family cabin up north, he said. His mom and dad had to leave suddenly that morning to deal with whatever crisis had emerged. It made sense, Dan supposed. These things happened with vacation properties, but as the days passed, Dan's relief began to transform back into concern. Chandler explained that cell service was spotty at the cabin, that his parents would only be able to communicate when atmospheric conditions were just right. It was a reasonable explanation for a remote location in northern Wisconsin. Sunday, July 4th. Chandler called Dan, complaining of boredom and asking if there was anything to do. Dan invited him over to watch fireworks, and during their conversation, asked about Bart and Krista. Chandler mentioned that he'd spoken with them, and they planned to return Monday. The detail was reassuring, even if something about the whole situation still felt slightly off. Monday came and went, with no sign of Krista at work. Tuesday brought more of the same. By Wednesday, July 7th, Dan's concern had transformed into genuine alarm. Krista had missed an important doctor's appointment that she'd been looking forward to, one that had already been rescheduled once. This wasn't like her at all. That morning, Dan pushed Chandler to do what needed to be done: file a missing persons report, get the authorities involved, find out what had happened to two people who had seemingly vanished without a trace. When Chandler Halderson walked into the Dane County Sheriff's Office that Wednesday morning, he appeared to be nothing more than a concerned son desperate for answers about his missing parents. He told investigators that Bart and Krista had left Thursday morning with another couple to spend the long weekend at the family cabin in Langlade County, about 3 hours north of Windsor. Detectives Sabrina Sims and Brian Shunk were assigned to lead the investigation. As they began gathering information, several details immediately stood out as unusual. Neither Bart nor Krista had mentioned to co-workers or friends that they were planning a trip. Their older son, Mitchell, had no knowledge of any weekend plans. And perhaps most puzzling of all, no one seemed to know who this mysterious other couple was supposed to be. The family cabin held special significance for the Haldersons. Built by Krista's grandparents in the 1940s, it was a rustic retreat on a remote lake where the family had created decades of memories. It was exactly the kind of place where cell phone service might be unreliable, where people could disappear from the digital world for days at a time. But as investigators began reaching out to friends and family members, they discovered something troubling. Despite Chandler's claims that his parents had been planning this trip, no one else had heard anything about it. Not their co-workers, not their extended family, not even Mitchell. The day after the missing persons report was filed, Mitchell and his fiancée made the 3-hour drive north to the family cabin. They met with deputies from the Langlade County Sheriff's Office, hoping against hope that they would find some sign of Bart and Krista, some indication that they had been there, even if they had since moved on to another location. What they found instead was an empty cabin that clearly hadn't been occupied in weeks. The canoe sat unused in its storage shed. Dust had settled on surfaces that should have shown signs of recent activity. It was obvious that no one had been to the property in a very long time. While Mitchell was searching the cabin, Chandler was back in Windsor, going door to door through the neighborhood. Security cameras captured him moving from house to house, asking neighbors if they had seen or heard anything unusual. To anyone watching, he appeared to be a devoted son desperately trying to find his missing parents. But investigators were beginning to notice inconsistencies in Chandler's story. Small details that didn't quite add up. questions that seemed to have different answers depending on when they were asked. And then they received a tip that would change the entire direction of their investigation. A local farm owner contacted the sheriff's office with information about Chandler Halderson. She was a friend of his girlfriend, Kat, and she told detectives that she had seen Chandler at her property over the 4th of July weekend. But more importantly, she had seen him return alone the following day, July 5th, when his car was parked backed up to a field near her woodline. This was the first time anyone had mentioned Chandler being anywhere other than home during the time his parents were supposedly missing. And when detectives asked him about it directly, he had never mentioned visiting this farm at all. The discovery would prove to be the thread that, when pulled, would unravel everything Chandler Halderson had been trying to hide. Because sometimes, the truth has a way of surfacing, no matter how deeply someone tries to bury it. The farm where deputies were now searching belonged to someone connected to Chandler's girlfriend, Catherine Melander, who went by Kat. As investigators combed through the rural property, looking for any sign of what Chandler might have been doing there alone, they made a discovery that would forever change the trajectory of this case. Hidden among the tall grass and scattered debris, deputies found human remains. Not a complete body, but a male torso that had been carefully concealed with sticks and twigs. The grass around the area had been matted down, creating a clear trail that led directly to the grisly discovery. Detective Sims would later describe it as unlike anything she had encountered in her career. Most death investigations involve intact victims, crime scenes that tell a coherent story. This was something else entirely, something that spoke to a level of violence and calculated disposal that chilled even experienced investigators to their core. The discovery of the remains triggered an immediate shift in the investigation. What had begun as a missing persons case was now clearly a homicide, and the timing couldn't be ignored. Here was evidence of violence found at a location where Chandler Halderson had been seen alone, just days after his parents had supposedly left for their cabin trip. When detectives brought Chandler back to the station for questioning, the tone of their conversation was markedly different. They couldn't reveal exactly what they had found, but they made it clear that his story was falling apart. They knew he wasn't telling them the truth, and they needed him to explain what had really happened. But Chandler wasn't ready to break. Instead, he did what many suspects do when confronted with evidence they can't explain. He asked for a lawyer. The interview was over before investigators could get the answers they desperately needed. Within days, DNA testing confirmed what detectives already suspected. The remains found on the farm belonged to Bart Halderson. The preliminary autopsy results revealed that he had been shot at least twice in the back. This wasn't an accident or a moment of passion. Someone had executed Bart Halderson with cold precision. The revelation sent shockwaves through the Windsor community. A loving father and husband had been murdered and dismembered, his body parts scattered and hidden like refuse. And the person who had reported him missing, who had gone door to door asking neighbors for help finding him, was now the prime suspect. Chandler was arrested and charged with providing false information to law enforcement. It was a holding charge while investigators built their murder case, but there was still one terrifying question that haunted everyone involved in the investigation. Where was Krista Halderson? The discovery of Bart's remains had answered one question while creating an even more urgent one. If Chandler had killed his father, what had happened to his mother? Was she still alive somewhere? Possibly being held against her will, or had she met the same fate as her husband? Time was critical. If Krista was still alive, every hour that passed reduced the chances of finding her. But if she was dead, investigators needed to locate her remains before evidence deteriorated further. The summer heat and natural decomposition were working against them. This is where Catherine Mellander's cooperation became absolutely crucial to the investigation. Kat had been dating Chandler for some time, and their relationship had been marked by infidelity and deception on his part. She had caught him cheating before, had confronted him about his lies, and had grown suspicious of his behavior. In response to her distrust, Kat had convinced Chandler to share his location with her through Snapchat. The popular social media app allows users to see where their friends are in real time, creating a digital trail of movement and activity. For Kat, it was a way to keep tabs on a boyfriend she no longer fully trusted. For investigators, it would prove to be the key to everything. When detectives asked for permission to download information from Kat's phone, she agreed without hesitation. She wanted to help find Bart and Krista, and she was beginning to suspect that her boyfriend might know more than he was telling anyone. What they found in Kat's phone records was a treasure trove of digital evidence. Not just location data, but timestamps, messages, and most importantly, a screenshot that Kat had saved during the crucial time period when the murders were believed to have occurred. The screenshot showed Chandler's Snapchat avatar positioned near the Wisconsin River, approximately 25 miles from his family home. The timestamp indicated it was taken on the morning of July 1st, and Kat had saved the image because she found his location suspicious. Why would her boyfriend be out in such a remote area so early in the morning? For investigators, this single piece of digital evidence was like finding a smoking gun. Here was proof that Chandler had been at a specific location during the time frame when his parents were supposedly leaving for their cabin trip. A location that was nowhere near his home, nowhere near any legitimate reason for him to be there. The area near the Wisconsin River where Chandler's phone had pinged was dense with woodland and difficult terrain. It was exactly the kind of place someone might go if they needed to dispose of evidence without being seen. The kind of place where human remains could be hidden and might never be found without a specific reason to search there. Law enforcement teams from throughout Dane County converged on the area. Using the Snapchat data as their starting point, they began a methodical search of the wooded region along the riverbank. The vegetation was thick, the summer growth making visibility limited and progress slow. Chandler had been to this area before. A photograph from the previous year showed him at the same location, holding a large knife and smiling for the camera. It was the kind of outdoorsy photo that many young men post on social media. But in the context of the current investigation, it took on a much darker significance. The search teams worked for hours, covering ground methodically and carefully documenting anything they found. The area was remote enough that evidence could have remained undisturbed for weeks, but the July heat and humidity were working against preservation. When they finally made the discovery they had been dreading, it confirmed their worst fears, hidden in the dense underbrush. Searchers found human remains that had been dismembered and scattered, 2 legs cut into different sections, concealed among the vegetation like discarded waste. DNA testing would confirm what everyone already knew in their hearts. The remains belonged to Krista Halderson, the loving mother and wife who had failed to show up for work that Friday morning, had met the same brutal fate as her husband, the young man who had reported his parents missing, who had appeared on local news pleading for help in finding them, who had gone door to door asking neighbors for any information about their whereabouts, had been the one responsible for their deaths all along. But the question that would drive the prosecution's case was still unanswered. What could possibly motivate a son to murder both of his parents in such a calculated and brutal manner? The answer, investigators would discover, lay in a web of lies so complex and elaborate that it had taken months to construct. Chandler Halderson had been living a completely fabricated life, telling everyone around him stories about academic success, professional opportunities, and future prospects that existed only in his imagination. And when that carefully constructed fantasy began to crumble, when the truth threatened to expose him, he had chosen the most unthinkable solution possible. The digital evidence that would ultimately convict him came from the very technology he had grown up with. Social media apps designed to connect people and share experiences had instead created an unbreakable chain of evidence that led directly to his doorstep. Sometimes the greatest danger comes from the person you think you know, a face you recognize, a voice you trust, someone who's been inside your home, someone you've hired, someone you've helped. It's September 8th, 2010, and for one Kansas woman, an ordinary morning is about to become a nightmare that will change her life forever. Marty Hill had no reason to be afraid that morning. At just 97 pounds, she was a powerhouse at work, known for her reliability and dedication. Her co-workers called her dynamite in a small package. She was the type of person who always showed up, always got things done, always made everything around her better. Which is exactly why, when she didn't show up for the 10 o'clock production meeting at her apparel company, everyone knew something was terribly wrong. The tight-knit group at her workplace had never seen Marty miss a meeting without explanation. She was dependable to a fault. When text messages went unanswered and phone calls went straight to voicemail, concern quickly turned to fear. By 11:30 that morning, a co-worker made the decision to drive to Marty's house. What they found there would launch an investigation that would reveal just how dangerous it can be to trust the wrong person. Marty's car sat in the driveway. Her front door was closed but unlocked. Her purse sat undisturbed on the kitchen table. But Marty was nowhere to be found upstairs. It wasn't until police arrived and ventured into the basement that they discovered the horrifying truth. At the bottom of those basement stairs lay a woman covered head to toe in blood, breathing but barely alive. The amount of blood surrounding her on the floor told a story of unimaginable violence. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong. This wasn't a random break-in. This was something far more personal and infinitely more terrifying. The officer who found her knelt beside the barely conscious woman and asked the question that would drive the entire investigation. Who did this to you? Who did this in those critical moments? As Marty fought for her life, the race was on to find her attacker before they could strike again. When paramedics rushed Marty to the hospital, doctors were stunned by the extent of her injuries. The major veins, skin, and muscle of her left neck had been completely severed. The major artery had multiple scrapes on it, missing complete severance by mere millimeters. Her face was swollen beyond recognition, covered in bruises that spoke to a sustained and vicious beating. The head trauma alone was life-threatening. For the next hour and a half, surgeons worked meticulously to piece together the damage, cleaning and repairing injuries that should have killed her. Even then, doctors remained gravely concerned about brain swelling and the possibility that Marty might not survive the next 24 to 72 hours. Her family arrived at the hospital to find a woman they barely recognized. Marty's eyes were swollen completely shut. Her head was 3 times its normal size. Her teenage daughter later described seeing only her mother's hands and knowing those were the only parts she could still identify. The emotional trauma of seeing their loved one in this condition was almost unbearable. But even as Marty fought for her life in the ICU, investigators were working around the clock to find her attacker. With no signs of sexual assault and no theft from the home, the motive remained a complete mystery. Marty's mother provided crucial information about her daughter's quiet lifestyle. She was a workaholic who rarely left the house except for work. She wasn't dating anyone and kept to herself. The investigation initially focused on Marty's ex-husband, Steve Hill. In cases like this, law enforcement always looks first at those closest to the victim. But Steve was cooperative, providing a detailed account of his activities that day and expressing genuine concern for Marty's well-being. He wanted to find her attacker just as desperately as everyone else did. With Steve cleared as a suspect, investigators found themselves with very limited leads. That's when Marty's mother mentioned B&J Construction, a company that had recently done work on both her home and Marty's. The supervisor, a man named Brian, had seemed like a nice guy, a hard worker, and a family man. Marty's mother had even recommended him based on the quality work he'd done at her house. Brian Pennington was 26 years old and lived in Leeton, Missouri, about an hour and a half from Kansas City. When detectives arrived at his secluded dark house around 9 p.m., they found him polite and cooperative. But something wasn't right. Brian had several fresh scratches on the left side of his face that he claimed came from his dog jumping on him the day before. To the trained eyes of experienced investigators, those scratches didn't look consistent with what a dog would do. Brian kept emphasizing his financial difficulties, claiming there was no way he could have driven to Kansas City because he didn't have money for gas. His young wife, Jessica, backed up his alibi, insisting he'd been home with her the entire time. But when detectives asked to search Brian's clothing for any bloodstains, he readily agreed. What they found in a hamper in the corner of the bathroom would change everything. A pair of jeans near the bottom was covered in red stains, concentrated around the knees and lower portions of the legs. Brian claimed the stains weren't blood, but when detectives rushed the jeans to the crime lab that same night, they tested positive for human blood within 30 minutes. The question now was whose blood it was, and investigators would have to wait several more days for DNA results. The cooperation Brian showed in allowing the search of his home surprised investigators. Most guilty parties don't willingly hand over evidence that could convict them. But perhaps Brian thought the investigation wouldn't go any further, that his word and his wife's alibi would be enough to clear him. Meanwhile, Marty remained in critical condition, unable to communicate with investigators. Doctors were cautiously optimistic, but her recovery was far from certain. The attack had been so brutal, so sustained, that it seemed impossible anyone could survive it. Yet somehow, Marty was fighting back. On the third day after the attack, everything changed. Marty suddenly began to speak, and with her words came the flood of memories from that terrible morning. There was no confusion, no uncertainty in her voice. She knew exactly who had attacked her and why she had opened her door to him that early morning. The man she named would shock everyone who knew him as a trusted contractor, a family man, someone who had been welcomed into homes throughout the community. But appearances, as this case would prove, can be fatally deceiving. As the DNA results came back, confirming that the blood on Brian Pennington's jeans belonged to Marty Hill, investigators realized they were dealing with someone far more dangerous than they had initially imagined. This wasn't a crime of passion or a robbery gone wrong. This was something much darker, and the question that haunted everyone involved was simple: why? Brian Pennington had been in Marty's home before. He'd done work there, earned her trust, been paid for his services. When he knocked on her door that September morning, she had no reason to fear him. She recognized his face, knew his voice, remembered the quality of his work. It was this familiarity that made him so dangerous. According to Marty's recollection, Brian mentioned something about the basement, something he thought she should know about from his previous work there. It seemed reasonable enough. Contractors often remembered details about jobs, noticed things that needed attention. So when he suggested they go downstairs to look at something, Marty led the way. She was 2 steps from the bottom when everything changed. Without warning, without explanation. Brian grabbed her throat with a grip so tight and strong that her voice began to fade. She kept asking what he was doing, but he remained silent. The man who had made pleasant conversation during his work visits now showed no emotion, offered no explanation for the violence he was inflicting. As her voice grew weaker and softer, Marty realized she couldn't speak at all. Then darkness took over, and she lost consciousness. What happened next would be reconstructed by forensic evidence and medical testimony, painting a picture of violence so extreme it defied comprehension. The investigation revealed that after strangling Marty into unconsciousness, Brian didn't stop there. Evidence suggested he then beat her head repeatedly against the concrete basement floor, causing multiple facial fractures and severe brain trauma. The sustained nature of the attack spoke to a level of rage that seemed completely disconnected from any rational motive. But even that wasn't enough. In what prosecutors would later describe as an act of pure evil, Brian then took out a knife and slashed Marty's throat 3 to 4 times, leaving her to die alone in her basement. The cuts were so deep they severed major blood vessels and came within millimeters of completely cutting through her main artery. The crime scene told a story of unimaginable brutality. Blood covered the basement floor from corner to corner. The violence had been so extensive, so sustained, that investigators who had worked hundreds of cases said they'd never seen anything quite like it. This wasn't the work of someone who had lost control in a moment of anger. This was methodical, deliberate, and designed to ensure the victim would not survive. But Brian Pennington had made one critical miscalculation. He believed Marty was dead when he left her basement that morning. He had no way of knowing that this small, seemingly fragile woman possessed a strength that would defy every medical expectation. When investigators arrived at his door that evening, Brian appeared genuinely surprised to learn that Marty was still alive. His cooperation during the initial interview now made perfect sense. If he believed his victim was dead, then there would be no witness to identify him. The scratches on his face could be explained away. The blood on his jeans could be dismissed as something else entirely. He likely thought the investigation would focus elsewhere, perhaps on a stranger or someone with an obvious motive. The DNA evidence changed everything. When the lab confirmed that the blood on Brian's jeans belonged to Marty Hill, investigators knew they had their man, but they still needed to understand the scope of who they were dealing with. Further investigation into Brian's background revealed a pattern of violence that painted a chilling picture of escalation. Records showed Brian had over 60 contacts with law enforcement officers throughout his young life. He had been involved in multiple domestic violence incidents that resulted in injuries to victims. 2 wives, 2 girlfriends, all had experienced his capacity for brutality. For Brian Pennington, beating women wasn't something new or unprecedented. It was a pattern of behavior that had been building towards something catastrophic. The revelation about Brian's history of domestic violence cast his wife Jessica's initial alibi in a different light. When detectives first interviewed her, she had seemed nervous, young, naive. She insisted her husband had been home with her during the entire time frame of the attack. But investigators suspected she was lying to protect him, possibly out of fear of what he might do to her if she told the truth. Jessica was only 20 years old with 2 young children. She had experienced Brian's violence firsthand and knew what he was capable of when crossed. Her initial lie wasn't born of loyalty, but of terror. She understood that cooperating with police could put her own life in danger. When investigators approached Jessica separately, away from her husband's presence, they were able to get her to open up about the truth. They explained to her how severely beaten Marty had been, how close she had come to dying, and how important it was for justice to be served. The human side of Jessica responded to this appeal. In a breakthrough moment for the case, Jessica broke down and admitted she had lied. Brian had not been home with her during the time of the attack. In fact, she revealed that her husband had a history of assaulting and threatening her as well. Her false alibi had been given out of fear, but learning about the extent of Marty's injuries helped her find the courage to tell the truth. Jessica's admission transformed her from a hostile witness protecting her abuser into one of the prosecution's most important allies. Her testimony would prove crucial in establishing that Brian had no alibi for the morning of the attack, and that his pattern of violence against women extended far beyond what happened to Marty. As the case against Brian Pennington solidified, investigators felt confident they could secure a conviction. The DNA evidence was ironclad. Marty's identification was clear and unwavering. Jessica's recanted testimony eliminated Brian's alibi. The scratches on his face corroborated a physical struggle. Everything pointed to one inescapable conclusion, but the question that haunted everyone involved in the case remained unanswered. Why had Brian Pennington decided to brutally attack a woman who had hired him, paid him fairly, and treated him with respect? There had been no theft from Marty's home. Money and valuables were left untouched. There was no evidence of sexual assault, no history of conflict or disagreement between them. The randomness of the violence was perhaps its most terrifying aspect. If Brian could attack Marty without any apparent motive, then no one who had ever hired him or interacted with him was truly safe. The realization sent shockwaves through the community and raised uncomfortable questions about how well we really know the people we invite into our homes and lives. For Marty's family, the arrest brought a mixture of relief and continued anguish. Relief that the monster who had nearly killed their loved one was behind bars. Anguish over the senseless nature of the crime and the long road to recovery that still lay ahead. The physical healing was only the beginning. The emotional and psychological trauma would take much longer to address. Marty herself faced the daunting prospect of rebuilding her life from the ground up. The brain injury had affected her balance, her vision, her hearing, her memory, and her ability to process information normally. Simple tasks that had once been automatic now required conscious effort and concentration. The strong, capable woman who had been known for her reliability and competence now struggled with basic functions, yet even as she fought to regain her physical abilities, Marty demonstrated the same determination that had kept her alive through the attack. With the support of her family and medical team, she began the slow process of recovery, knowing that her survival and her willingness to testify would be crucial to ensuring Brian Pennington faced justice for his crimes. The legal proceedings that followed would test everyone involved in ways they never imagined. Brian Pennington was charged with attempted first-degree murder, and the prosecution was determined to see him serve the maximum sentence allowed under law. The evidence seemed overwhelming, but in the American justice system, even the most clear-cut cases can take unexpected turns. As preparations for trial began, the prosecution team faced a critical decision about how to present their case. The DNA evidence on Pennington's genes was powerful, but they knew defense attorneys would try to create reasonable doubt wherever possible. The lack of a clear motive remained problematic, giving the defense room to argue that perhaps someone else had committed the crime. Marty's recovery continued slowly but steadily. The woman who had once been known for her sharp mind and quick wit now struggled with basic cognitive functions. Her speech was sometimes unclear, her memory had gaps, and her physical coordination remained impaired. The prosecution worried whether she would be strong enough to testify, and whether a jury would find her testimony credible given her brain injury. But Marty possessed something that no amount of physical trauma could destroy: an unshakable determination to see justice done. She worked tirelessly with speech therapists and physical rehabilitation specialists, driven by the knowledge that her testimony could be the key to putting her attacker behind bars. Her children watched in amazement as their mother fought to reclaim pieces of herself that had been stolen in those terrible minutes in her basement. The preliminary hearing arrived with tremendous anticipation and anxiety. This would be the first time Marty would face her attacker in a courtroom setting, and no one knew how she would react. The stakes couldn't have been higher. If the prosecution failed to convince the judge there was sufficient evidence to proceed to trial, Pennington would walk free. When Pennington was brought into the courtroom, the contrast was stark. He sat alone on his side of the room, with no family members present to support him. Not even his mother had come. He stared straight ahead, showing no emotion, until Marty entered the courtroom. Only then did his head turn, his eyes following her slow, deliberate walk to the witness stand. Those who witnessed that moment described it as chilling. Pennington's expression seemed to convey disbelief that his victim was not only alive, but walking into court to testify against him. The ghost he thought he had created was very much real and very much determined to see him pay for what he had done. Marty's testimony was powerful in its simplicity. Despite her injuries and the trauma she had endured, her identification of Pennington was clear and unwavering. She looked directly at him as she spoke, showing a courage that inspired everyone in the courtroom. Her voice may have been weaker than before, but her words carried the weight of absolute truth. The prosecution's case was further strengthened when Jessica Pennington took the stand. Her decision to tell the truth about her husband's whereabouts that morning was crucial, but it came at great personal cost. She knew that by testifying against him, she was putting herself and her children at risk of retaliation. Yet she found the strength to do what was right. The judge ruled that there was sufficient evidence to proceed to trial. But as the case moved forward, unexpected developments began to emerge. Pennington's defense team, recognizing the strength of the evidence against their client, began exploring the possibility of a plea agreement. The prospect of facing a jury with DNA evidence, victim identification, and witness testimony seemed daunting even to experienced defense attorneys. Negotiations between the prosecution and defense stretched on for months. The central question was how much time Pennington would serve in prison. The prosecution wanted to ensure he would be locked away for as long as legally possible, while the defense sought to minimize his sentence. For Marty and her family, the uncertainty was agonizing. Eventually, both sides reached an agreement. Pennington would plead guilty to the charges against him in exchange for a sentence of 28.5 years in prison. For the prosecution, it guaranteed a significant prison term without the uncertainty of a jury trial. For Marty, it meant she wouldn't have to endure the grueling process of a full trial and could begin to find some closure. But even this resolution would not come without drama. On the day of sentencing, as family members prepared to deliver victim impact statements, Pennington shocked everyone by attempting to withdraw his guilty plea. After weeks of accepting responsibility for his actions, he suddenly claimed the pressure was too much and the sentence too long. The judge was having none of it. Pennington's reasons for wanting to withdraw his plea were deemed insufficient, and the sentencing proceeded as planned. One by one, Marty's family members stood before the court to tell Pennington exactly how his actions had affected their lives. Her teenage daughter's statement was particularly powerful. She looked directly at Pennington as she spoke about the trauma of seeing her mother in the hospital, about the fear that had consumed their family, about the strength they had found in each other. Even though Pennington refused to look at her, she knew he was hearing every word. Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for. Marty herself stood before the man who had tried to kill her. Her voice was steady as she spoke about his betrayal of her trust, about the pain he had caused not just to her, but to everyone who loved her. She asked him the question that had haunted her since that terrible morning. "Why did you do this to me?" Pennington's response was silence. Even given the opportunity to explain his actions, to show some remorse, to offer some understanding of what had driven him to such violence, he chose to say nothing. That silence spoke volumes about the kind of person he truly was. The judge sentenced Brian Pennington to 28.5 years in the Kansas state prison system. He would have to serve at least a significant portion of that sentence before becoming eligible for parole. For a man who had lived only 26 years, the prospect of spending more time behind bars than he had spent as a free man was sobering. Today, Marty Hill continues her recovery, forever changed, but never broken by what happened to her. The scars on her neck serve as a constant reminder of how close she came to death, but they also represent her incredible survival. She has returned to kickboxing, pushing herself physically as part of her ongoing rehabilitation. The woman who once weighed 97 pounds and was known as dynamite in a small package has proven that some forces of nature cannot be extinguished. Her story serves as a chilling reminder that evil can wear a familiar face, that danger can come from the most unexpected sources. Brian Pennington wasn't a stranger lurking in shadows. He was someone Marty knew, someone she had trusted, someone she had welcomed into her home. That betrayal of trust makes his crime even more heinous, and her survival even more remarkable. The question of motive may never be fully answered. Pennington's silence has left his victim and her family without the closure that understanding might bring. But perhaps that's fitting. Some acts of violence are so senseless, so devoid of rational explanation, that trying to understand them is futile. What matters is that justice was served, that a dangerous predator was removed from society, and that a remarkable woman found the strength to survive and rebuild her life. In the end, this case reminds us all to be vigilant, to trust our instincts, and to remember that sometimes the greatest threats come from those we least suspect. The stranger you know may be the most dangerous stranger of all. Imagine living in a place where everyone knows your name, where Friday night football games bring the whole town together, and the biggest worry is whether Mrs. Henderson's apple pie will win first place at the county fair again. A place where kids ride their bikes until the streetlights come on, and parents never think twice about letting them walk to school alone. This was Acme, Washington in 1989. A tiny logging community nestled in the shadow of the North Cascade Mountains, where trust wasn't just expected, it was a way of life. The kind of place where folks still left their doors unlocked and helped their neighbors without being asked. But sometimes, the most peaceful places harbor the darkest secrets. And sometimes, evil finds its way into paradise. On a crisp November morning in 1989, that peace would be shattered forever. A young woman's life would be stolen, a family would be destroyed, and an entire community would discover that safety is just an illusion. This is the story of Mandy Stavik, and the case that haunted a small town for nearly 3 decades. 18-year-old Amanda Stavik was everything you'd want in a daughter. Bright, athletic. Ambitious, the kind of girl who lit up every room she entered. She'd been the star of her high school basketball team, a cheerleader, and one of the top students in her graduating class. Everyone called her Mandy, and everyone loved her. After graduating from Mount Baker High School, Mandy had headed off to Central Washington University with dreams of becoming a commercial airline pilot. It was an ambitious goal for a young woman in the late 80s, but those who knew Mandy weren't surprised. She'd always been determined to reach for the sky. Thanksgiving weekend 1989 found Mandy back home in Acme, taking a break from her freshman year of college. She was excited to spend time with her family, catch up with old friends, and enjoy the familiar comfort of the place she'd grown up. The day after Thanksgiving, November 24th, dawned clear and cold. It was the kind of crisp autumn day that made you want to get outside and breathe in the mountain air. For Mandy, who'd been a runner throughout high school, it was the perfect morning for a jog. She'd developed a routine during her years at Mount Baker High. Almost every day, she'd lace up her running shoes, clip a leash on her German Shepherd Kira, and head out onto the rural roads that wound through the countryside around Acme. It was her time to think, to clear her head, and to stay in the kind of shape that had made her such a formidable athlete. That Friday morning was no different. Mandy pulled on her running clothes, said goodbye to her family, and headed out with Kira by her side. She planned to follow her usual route, a path that would take her along Strand Road, past farmhouses and wooded areas, through the heart of the community she called home. It should have been just another run, but Mandy Stavik would never make it home. Hours passed, then more hours. As the afternoon wore on and evening approached, Mandy's family began to worry. She was responsible, reliable, not the type to disappear without explanation. When darkness fell and she still hadn't returned, they knew something was terribly wrong. The search began immediately. Friends, neighbors, family members, everyone who could help, fanned out across the rural roads and forest trails around Acme. They called her name until their voices were hoarse. They searched with flashlights long into the night. Kira, Mandy's faithful German shepherd, had returned home alone earlier that day. The dog was agitated, pacing nervously, as if trying to communicate something she couldn't express. But where was Mandy? For 3 agonizing days, the search continued. Volunteers scoured every inch of the countryside. Helicopters circled overhead. Boats searched the rivers and streams that cut through the landscape. The entire community came together, united in their desperate hope to bring Mandy home safely. But hope turned to horror on November 27th. Detective Ron Peterson was part of the search team that day. He'd been methodically working his way along the south fork of the Nooksack River in his Zodiac boat when something caught his eye. There, in a quiet side channel away from the main river, he spotted something pink floating in the dark water. It was Mandy. The discovery sent shockwaves through the tight-knit community. This wasn't supposed to happen in Acme. This wasn't supposed to happen anywhere, but especially not here, in their safe haven tucked away from the troubles of the wider world. As investigators began to piece together what had happened, a terrifying picture emerged. Mandy hadn't simply had an accident. She hadn't gotten lost or fallen into the river. Someone had deliberately taken her life. The evidence suggested that Mandy had been abducted while out on her run, likely by someone in a vehicle. She was too fast a runner to be caught on foot. Investigators reasoned her attacker had probably used a weapon to force her compliance, then taken her to a location several miles from her jogging route. What happened next was every parent's worst nightmare. Mandy had been sexually assaulted, but she hadn't given up without a fight. Scratches on her arms and legs suggested she'd tried to escape, running through blackberry bushes in a desperate attempt to get away from her attacker. In the end, her efforts weren't enough. Her killer had caught up with her, knocked her unconscious, and then placed her in the river to ensure she wouldn't survive. For Detective Peterson, who had children of his own, the case was deeply personal. As he recovered Mandy's body from the cold water, he whispered words that no parent should ever have to say. The memory of that moment would stay with him for the rest of his life. The investigation that followed was intense and thorough. Tips poured in from concerned citizens. Police interviewed dozens of potential suspects. They looked at everyone from local drifters to Mandy's own boyfriend, methodically working to rule out each possibility. One early person of interest was David Succi, a transient who'd been seen in the area on the day of Mandy's disappearance. But when investigators obtained his DNA, it didn't match evidence found at the crime scene. In fact, despite collecting DNA samples from 30 different men in the area, investigators came up empty. None of the samples matched. The case that had started with such promise, with physical evidence that should have led directly to the killer, suddenly hit a brick wall as months turned to years. The Mandy Stavik case began to go cold. The detective assigned to it would change. Files would be boxed up and stored away. The daily urgency that had driven the investigation would fade, but the impact on the community never did. In a place like Acme, everyone knew everyone. Mandy's murder didn't just take away a beloved daughter, sister, and friend. It stole something more fundamental, the sense of security that had defined life in this small town. Parents who had never worried about their children playing outside after dark suddenly found themselves checking locks twice before bed. Runners who had felt safe on the rural roads began looking over their shoulders. The easy trust that had been the foundation of community life was replaced by a nagging fear that the killer was still out there, still among them. Years passed, a decade, then another. The case remained officially open, but with each passing year, it seemed less likely that justice would ever be served. Mandy's family never stopped hoping, never stopped asking questions, but even they began to wonder if they would ever know the truth about what happened to their daughter. 25 years would pass before everything changed. 25 years before a casual conversation at a water park would crack the case wide open. 25 years before the people of Acme would finally learn that the monster they'd feared was someone they'd known all along. The breakthrough came from the most unlikely source imaginable. Two mothers, sitting on the grass at a local water park, watching their children splash down slides and play in the summer sun. They barely knew each other, these women, Heather Backstrom and Marilee Anderson, but they shared a connection that went back decades to their high school years at Mount Baker High. It was June 2013, and somehow the conversation turned to Mandy Stavik. Maybe it was the way the sunlight caught the water, or the sound of children laughing, that made them think of innocence lost, whatever prompted it. When Mandy's name came up, both women felt something stir inside them, a recognition, a shared suspicion they'd carried in silence for far too long. I just turned to Marilee and said, "Well, I'm sure I know who killed her," Heather would later recall. And she turned to me and said, "Oh, I do too." The name that came from both their lips was Timothy Bass. Tim Bass had been just another face in the halls of Mount Baker High School back in the late 80s. He wasn't particularly memorable, not a star athlete, not a troublemaker, not someone who stood out in any obvious way. He was just there, part of the background of small-town life. But for both Heather and Marilee, Tim Bass had been anything but forgettable. Each woman had experienced encounters with him that had left them deeply unsettled. Encounters they'd never spoken about publicly, but had never been able to shake. For Heather, the memory went back to the summer of 1989, just months before Mandy's murder. She was 15 years old, sitting in a friend's truck after a softball game, when Tim Bass, then in his 20s, climbed in beside her. What started as casual conversation quickly turned uncomfortable. He began talking about her eyes, telling her how beautiful they were. Then he picked up a pen from the cup holder and began running it along her knees as she sat there in her cut-off sweatpants. She was just a teenager, trapped in a vehicle with an older man whose attention felt predatory and wrong. I was very nervous. She would remember years later. The incident had stayed with her, a moment of vulnerability and fear that she'd carried in silence. But Marilee's story was even more chilling. It was July 1991, nearly 2 years after Mandy's death. Marilee was at home alone with her young son when she heard a knock at her door. When she opened it, there stood Tim Bass, claiming he'd been hunting all day and needed to use her phone to call his wife. Something about his presence made her uncomfortable, but she let him in. When she handed him the phone, he dialed a number, but all they heard was the electronic beeping that indicated the call couldn't be completed. The number was disconnected or had never existed at all. Then, Tim's behavior became truly frightening. He walked through her kitchen toward her bedroom, making himself at home in her private space. He told her he used to drive by her house, that he'd always been in love with her, that he wanted to make love to her right then and there. Marilee was terrified. Here was a man who had inserted himself into her home under false pretenses, who was now making sexual advances while her child was nearby. She demanded that he leave, but he refused. Only when she threatened to call the police did he finally go. For more than 20 years, both women had carried these experiences alone, in a small town. Accusing someone of something you couldn't prove was dangerous. Reputations mattered. Families had to live together in the same community. Speaking up without absolute certainty felt impossible. But sitting there in that water park, watching their own children play, they realized they couldn't stay silent any longer. If their suspicions were right, if Tim Bass had killed Mandy Stavik, then their silence was protecting a murderer. They reached out to law enforcement, sharing their stories with Detective Ken Gates, another Mount Baker High graduate who understood the dynamics of their small community. The information was intriguing, but it wasn't evidence. After 24 years, police needed more than suspicions and uncomfortable memories. What they discovered when they began looking into Tim Bass was a man who had been hiding in plain sight all along. For the past quarter century, while Mandy's family grieved and the community lived in fear, Tim Bass had been living a quiet, seemingly normal life just miles from where the murder had taken place. He'd gotten married just 6 weeks after Mandy's death, settled down with his wife Gina, and had 3 children. He worked as a delivery driver for a local bakery, making his rounds through the very communities that had been searching for Mandy's killer. He had no significant criminal record. He kept to himself, went to work, came home. To all outward appearances, he was just another small-town family man living an unremarkable life. But the most shocking discovery was where he'd been living in 1989. Tim Bass's family home sat less than 2 miles from Mandy's house, right along one of her regular jogging routes. If he'd been looking out his window on any given day, he could have watched her run past. He could have learned her patterns, her timing, her routine. When police finally approached Bass in 2013, his behavior immediately raised red flags. Asked about Mandy Stavik, He pretended not to remember her at first. Mandy, he said, as if searching his memory. Oh yeah, she was a girl that they found in the river. Who could forget Mandy Stavik in a community the size of Acme? Her murder had been the defining tragedy of their generation. For someone who'd attended the same high school, lived in the same area, to claim he barely remembered her seemed absurd. When investigators asked Bass for a DNA sample, his refusal was immediate and telling. "I don't want to give my DNA," he said. "I watch those crime shows. I see how many people go to prison because they've given DNA." His refusal meant police had to get creative. They put Bass under surveillance, following him on his bakery delivery routes, hoping he would discard something that might contain his DNA. Night after night, they watched and waited. But Bass was careful. He threw nothing away that could be tested. The investigation might have stalled there. But Tim Bass had made one crucial mistake. He'd underestimated the people around him, particularly the women who worked alongside him every day. Kim Wagner was Bass's supervisor at the bakery, and she'd never quite felt comfortable around him. There was something off about the way he interacted with people, especially women. He never called her by name, instead referring to her simply as woman. The smallest things would set him off into angry outbursts, making co-workers wary of being around him. When investigators contacted the bakery and Kim realized they were investigating the Mandy Stavik murder, she put two and two together. They wanted DNA evidence from Tim Bass, and she was in a position to help them get it. For 3 months, Kim watched and waited, every day. She emptied the trash cans to make sure they were clean, hoping Tim would discard a cup or bottle that might contain his saliva. Every day, she watched him carefully, looking for her opportunity. Finally, it came. She saw him throw away a plastic cup, and later a Coke can. Her heart was racing as she retrieved the items, knowing that she might be handling evidence that could solve one of the most notorious crimes in the region's history. She hid the items in her desk drawer until she could turn them over to police. The wait for test results felt endless. But when Detective Kevin Bowie finally got the call from the state crime lab, the words he heard changed everything. "We've got a match." 28 years after Mandy Stavik's murder, police finally had their killer. The arrest of Timothy Bass on December 12, 2017, sent shockwaves through the community that had waited so long for answers. As Detective Bowie placed the handcuffs on the 50-year-old delivery driver in the bakery parking lot, the weight of nearly 3 decades seemed to lift from the shoulders of everyone who had never forgotten Mandy Stavik. But having a suspect and proving guilt in court are two very different things. Bass maintained his innocence, and his defense team was prepared to fight every piece of evidence the prosecution presented. When confronted with the DNA match, Bass's story began to evolve in ways that shocked even seasoned investigators. The man who had initially claimed he barely remembered Mandy suddenly had a very different tale to tell. He now insisted that he and Mandy had been having a secret affair, that their encounter had been consensual. It was a desperate gambit, one that required the jury to believe that an 18-year-old college freshman would have willingly engaged in a relationship with a man she'd never been seen with, never called, never mentioned to family or friends. The defense argued that DNA evidence only proved contact had occurred, not that a crime had been committed. But the prosecution had more than just DNA. They had a pattern of behavior that painted a disturbing picture of Timothy Bass. His own family members took the stand against him, describing a man who had shown disturbing attitudes toward women throughout his life. His ex-wife testified about years of controlling, abusive behavior. His brother revealed how Bass had asked him to lie to police, even suggesting they blame their deceased father for the crime. Perhaps most damning was the testimony from Kim Wagner, the brave woman who had helped police obtain the crucial DNA evidence. Her decision to act had been driven by a simple principle: doing what was right for Mandy. The trial lasted 9 days, but the jury's deliberation was mercifully brief. After just 5 hours, they returned with their verdict: guilty on all counts of first-degree murder, first-degree rape, and first-degree kidnapping. 29 years and 6 months after Mandy Stavik was found floating in the Nooksack River, justice had finally been served. At his sentencing, Bass continued to proclaim his innocence, but Judge Evan Chaffee was unmoved. He sentenced Bass to nearly 27 years in prison, ensuring that the man who had stolen so much from so many would spend the rest of his meaningful life behind bars. For Mandy's family, the verdict brought a mixture of relief and continued grief. Her mother, Mary, who had spent decades wondering if she would ever see justice for her daughter, finally had her answer. Her sister, Molly, who had carried the pain of loss for so long, could finally begin to heal. But perhaps the most profound impact was felt by the community of Acme itself. The arrest and conviction of Timothy Bass didn't just solve a murder case. It gave back something that had been stolen from them nearly 30 years earlier. The fear that had shadowed their daily lives, the suspicion that had tainted their interactions, the loss of innocence that had changed their community forever. None of that could be completely undone, but they could finally stop looking over their shoulders. They could finally trust that the monster who had walked among them was where he belonged. The case of Mandy Stavik became more than just a murder investigation. It became a testament to the power of persistence, the importance of community, and the courage of ordinary people to do extraordinary things. From Detective Bowie, who never gave up on a case that others had written off, to Kim Wagner, who risked her own safety to help catch a killer, to the 2 mothers at a water park who finally found the courage to speak up. It took a village to bring Timothy Bass to justice. Today, Acme remains a small, close-knit community nestled in the shadow of the mountains. Children still play outside until the streetlights come on. Neighbors still help neighbors. And while the scars of November 1989 will never completely fade, the people of this town have reclaimed something precious: the knowledge that evil may find its way into paradise, but it cannot stay hidden forever. Mandy Stavik was just 18 years old when her life was cut short, but her legacy lives on in the justice that was finally served and in the community that never forgot her name. In the end, love proved stronger than fear, truth more powerful than lies, and justice, though delayed, would not be denied. This was the case no one could forget, and now, finally, no one has to. Shirley Seitz grew up in northern Alabama, a region known for its small churches lining the roads and the sounds of gospel music filling Sunday mornings. She was raised in a working-class, faith-driven family that valued giving over taking and encouraged living life with purpose, kindness, and passion for music. From an early age, Shirley was captivated by music and ministry. Those who knew her spoke of her as a warm, charismatic woman whose voice could inspire and comfort everyone who heard it. Her favorite hymn, Amazing Grace, was more than a song to her. It was how she approached life. She embodied the qualities of an evangelist, someone who didn't just preach the word, but lived it, demonstrating compassion and service daily. Shirley not only kept her faith, but also actively participated in pastoral activities. She traveled to churches and gatherings across the region, not as a celebrity or famous singer, but as someone who connected sincerely with others. Her storytelling brought scripture to life, and her presence in the room was unforgettable. However, Shirley's life wasn't without challenges. Despite her deep faith, she experienced difficulties, particularly in her relationships. She had been married several times, enduring the heartbreak of failed relationships that ended in disappointment or disillusionment. Nonetheless, she remained hopeful and never stopped believing in love. Her family admired her perseverance in always seeing the good in people, even when others did not see it. By the time Shirley met Michael Vollschlager, she was in her 50s. Her children were grown, and she had recently inherited a significant sum following the death of her previous husband, providing her with financial stability for the first time. While she wasn't looking for a fairy tale romance, she sought a partnership built on trust, respect, and shared faith. Michael entered her life with charm and confidence. A chiropractor by profession, he had practiced in Florida and claimed to have helped many through his work. Known as Dr. Mike, he projected an image of purpose and refinement that resonated with Shirley's values. He shared stories of past struggles and emphasized his Christian beliefs. To Shirley, who had always seen herself as a healer, Michael seemed like someone deserving of redemption, and she wanted to give him that chance. In the early days of their relationship, Shirley appeared happy. She and Michael married after just 3 months of courtship. However, her family, particularly her daughter and brothers, expressed concerns about the rapid pace of the relationship and Michael's financial instability, failed past relationships, and lack of a steady job. Despite their reservations, Shirley asked them to trust her judgment. After their marriage, Shirley and Michael moved into a small house in Loxley, South Alabama, on a street with the charming name Camelot. For Shirley, the name symbolized hope for a lifetime of happiness. She sought to create a peaceful life filled with prayer, music, and visits from loved ones. Shirley supported Michael financially in the beginning, covering expenses for their home, furniture, and vehicle, viewing these as acts of love rather than burdens. Despite their initial concerns, Shirley's family tried to welcome Michael. They joined the couple for meals, family celebrations, and holidays. Shirley's mother Myrtle, her daughter Sharon, and her brother Ricky stayed closely connected through frequent visits and calls. Shirley had always been the emotional anchor of the family, making each member feel valued and appreciated. Her family treasured this closeness and wanted to preserve it. Even after she remarried, Shirley was a steadfast presence in her community, continuing to lead worship services and provide spiritual guidance to those who turned to her. She was rarely seen in public without a smile, staying true to the principles that had always defined her: honesty, humility, and forgiveness. Her conversations with family were often filled with scripture and warm words of encouragement. Even during difficult moments or when she felt overwhelmed, she worked hard to shield those around her from her struggles. However, over time, the family began to notice small but noticeable changes in Shirley. Her voice, once strong and self-assured, began to waver. Her energy seemed drained, and she spoke differently about her life at home. Although she never directly criticized her husband, small comments hinted at financial pressures or emotional fatigue. True to her nature, Shirley kept most of her worries to herself, not wanting to burden others. To her family, she still seemed like a woman determined to make her relationship work. A woman holding on to faith in love, despite having gone through 4 previous marriages. She still gives her time, resources, faith, and trust to others. Yet, None of them could have foreseen the storm ahead. Even as doubt began to creep into their minds, they had no way of imagining the tragedy that would soon unfold. On the surface, Shirley and Michael appear to be an ordinary couple, living peacefully in a small town in Alabama. However, behind the closed doors, tensions were escalating, slowly at first. Then, with alarming intensity, Shirley's family began feeling uneasy after her marriage to Michael. Their concerns weren't based on mere suspicion, but on clear changes they observed. Shirley, once vibrant with joy and spiritual energy, seemed to be retreating from her old self. Her phone calls became less frequent. She stopped visiting her family as frequently, and her daughter Sharon noticed how she avoided questions about Michael and their finances. Unbeknownst to her family, Shirley had been almost entirely supporting Michael. He had no steady job or reliable source of income, yet his financial demands continued to grow. Shirley used the life insurance money from her late husband to sustain their life together, paying for their home, buying him a truck, and helping him with overdue bills. What began as generosity on Shirley's part eventually turned into an expectation. And finally, an obligation. As the financial strain increased, emotional distance followed. Michael began pressuring Shirley for more money, and while she initially resisted quietly, her unease began to show. In conversations with her daughter and mother, she cautiously shared her concerns. In a phone call, she mentioned that Michael was very upset when she brought up the bills. However, her reluctance to elaborate left her family unaware of the full extent of the trouble. The last time Shirley was seen alive was March 21, 2010. That night, during their conversation, she told her daughter Sharon that she loved her, without any urgency. The following day, she stopped answering her phone, which was unlike her. Sharon grew anxious. Her mother never went silent without reason. When Ricky, Shirley's brother, went to her house to check on her, Michael met him outside, calm and composed. Michael claimed Shirley had left with a friend for a spiritual retreat, but something felt wrong. The house was unnervingly quiet. Shirley's purse and phone were inside. Her car was still in the driveway, and Michael, while outwardly calm, showed no genuine concern. Alarmed, the family reported Shirley missing within hours. The Loxley Police Department launched an investigation. Officers searched the house, the nearby woods, and pressed Michael for answers. His story quickly unraveled. Initially, he said Shirley had gone out alone. Later, he claimed she had left with someone from church, but he couldn't name anyone or explain why her belongings had been left behind. The inconsistencies raised suspicion, and investigators began digging into Michael's background. What they uncovered painted a disturbing picture. Michael had a history of deception and exploitation. Court records revealed a string of failed relationships, financial troubles, and manipulative behavior. His past wives had accused him of fraud, emotional abuse, and even making threats. Shirley seemed to have fallen for his charm, only to end up as the latest victim in a disturbing pattern. As the investigation escalated, police used cadaver dogs to search the property. On March 24th, 3 days after Shirley vanished, the dogs led officers to a shallow grave behind her and Michael's home. Upon digging, investigators unearthed a tarp. Beneath it, wrapped tightly in layers of plastic, lay the body of Shirley. Her face had been covered in duct tape, and her body showed signs of restraint. The autopsy concluded that her death was caused by asphyxiation. This was no accident. It was intentional. The crime scene revealed a chilling story. Shirley's disappearance wasn't straightforward. She was murdered in her own home, likely on the night she last spoke with her daughter. Her body was buried just feet from the house where she had once sung gospel hymns and prayed for peace. Michael was arrested immediately. During his initial interview, he denied any involvement. He claimed ignorance, suggested someone else was responsible, and argued he was being framed. However, the evidence told a different story. Investigators uncovered signs of a struggle inside the home. Blood found in the bedroom and hallway matched Shirley's. The duct tape discovered on her face was identical to a roll found in the garage. Cell phone records placed Michael near the burial site in the early morning hours following her disappearance. Further investigation revealed a motive. Shirley had recently confronted Michael about financial issues. She had begun to assert herself, talking about cutting off money and needing space. Michael, fearing the loss of his home, truck, and financial security, snapped. Police believed greed drove him. He had grown accustomed to the comforts Shirley's generosity provided. When she started resisting, he saw no way forward except to eliminate her. The arrest left the small town in shock. Neighbors who once exchanged pleasantries with Michael now spoke to reporters. Church friends wept. Shirley, a woman known for her kindness and service, had been killed by the very man she tried to love and support. In the aftermath, more of Shirley's loved ones came forward. Some recalled seeing unexplained bruises she dismissed. Others mentioned that they had heard her say she didn't want to fight anymore, but had assumed she was referring to verbal arguments. No one had imagined it would escalate to that. The district attorney acted swiftly, assembling a case that painted Michael as calculating and manipulative. They gathered digital evidence, financial records, and statements from his former spouses. A disturbing pattern emerged: a man who used charm, faith, and emotional neediness to exploit vulnerable women, draining them financially and emotionally. In Shirley's case, the outcome was deadly. Michael's trial began in Baldwin County, Alabama, gripping the small community with disbelief and anger. Once seen smiling in family photos with Shirley, Michael now stood accused of first-degree murder. Prosecutors focused their strategy on proving intent, motive, and premeditation. Every detail, they argued, demonstrated that the crime was deliberate. The timeline was critical. Prosecutors outlined how Shirley was last heard from on March 21, 2010. Her car, purse, and phone were left behind. Michael's accounts of her disappearance were riddled with inconsistencies. Detectives testified about the grave, describing it as hastily dug and shallow but deliberately hidden under a blue tarp and littered with debris. Medical experts confirmed Shirley's death resulted from asphyxiation, likely due to the duct tape wrapped around her face. Gruesome crime scene photos were shown in court, depicting Shirley's bound and wrapped body buried close to her home. The images were unbearable for her family, with some leaving the courtroom, while others silently leaned on one another for support. Financial records presented by the prosecution revealed that Shirley had been funding Michael's lifestyle, covering expenses like the mortgage and his truck. Her daughter Sharon and brother Ricky testified that Shirley had grown increasingly frustrated in the weeks before her death. She had started setting boundaries, saying no more often, and shared that she was contemplating changes in her life. Prosecutors argued that these actions triggered Michael's fear of losing his financial support, leading him to commit murder out of desperation. This case struck the core of the close-knit community, as neighbors mourned the loss of Shirley, generous, loving, and undeserving of what happened. Michael's defense team presented an alternative perspective. While they didn't dispute that Shirley was dead or that her body was discovered on Michael's property, they argued that her death wasn't premeditated. They claimed the tragedy resulted from an argument that spiraled out of control. causing Michael to act out of panic rather than calculated intent. They sought to depict him as an emotionally distraught man, overwhelmed and desperate, rather than a deliberate murderer. However, the jury also heard testimony from Michael's former spouses, which painted a vastly different and more disturbing picture. Two women described a history of manipulation in Michael's past relationships, including financial control, emotional abuse, and subtle threats. While the court carefully limited the scope of these testimonies, they underscored a consistent narrative. Michael appeared outwardly charming, but behaved very differently in private. Michael chose not to testify in his defense, leaving his legal team to rely solely on cross-examination and closing arguments to raise doubt. Ultimately, the evidence was overwhelming, the inconsistencies impossible to ignore, and the tragedy undeniable. After only a few hours of deliberation, the jury delivered its decision. Michael Wollschläger was found guilty of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. For Shirley's family, the verdict brought some measure of justice, but no peace. No ruling could reverse the events or bring Shirley back. The courtroom offered something the family had sought since her disappearance: certainty. In that moment, they knew what had happened, even if it couldn't undo their loss. In Loxley, Alabama, a quiet, close-knit community, life eventually returned to its regular pace. Yet Shirley's absence left a void that could never be filled. Her death cast a long shadow over the town she had once served so faithfully. Her voice, once a source of praise and worship, lived on only in the memories of those who loved her. Shirley's family bore a layered grief. There was the pain of losing a mother, younger sister, and daughter. But there was also the agony of hindsight. They had felt uneasy about her quick marriage to Michael, worried about her silences, and ignored instincts that something was wrong. Despite all this, Shirley had never asked for help, a fact that haunted them deeply. She had always been the one others leaned on for support, for strength, and when she needed help herself, she chose to carry the burden alone. Shirley's daughter, Sharon, who used to call her mother daily, later admitted that she wished she had tried harder to visit earlier. However, her mom always gave the impression that everything was fine, even when it wasn't. Sharon's words expressed a poignant pain shared by many families of victims, a mix of loss and helplessness. In the churches where Shirley once led congregations in song, vigils were held in her memory. Beneath her photograph, candles flickered as pastors spoke of forgiveness, strength, and justice. They also stressed vigilance, warning how evil can often disguise itself with charm and kindness. Michael Wollschläger would spend the rest of his life behind bars, with no chance of parole or appeals to undo his actions. While legal justice was served, the deeper wound, the loss of Shirley and all she brought to the world, remained unhealed. Shirley lived her life rooted in faith, believing in redemption, second chances, and the goodness of others. Ironically, it was this unwavering trust that cost her everything. But it also defined her legacy. For those who loved her, it was this light, her faith, resilience, and quiet strength that they carried forward. Jeffrey Marsalis, born in the 1970s and raised in Idaho, grew up in a state better known for its scenic mountains and ski resorts than national scandals. While not especially prominent, the Marsalis family was well regarded in the local community, appearing to be an average, stable, upper-middle-class household, quiet, tidy, and seemingly ordinary. From a young age, Jeffrey was seen as intelligent, composed, and self-assured. Teachers described him as clever, sometimes too clever, with a keen sense of observation that could inspire either admiration or suspicion. He wasn't outspoken, but he thrived on being persuasive, often taking on the role of a subtle performer. As a teenager, Jeffrey was athletic, clean-cut, and active in school organizations. He avoided trouble, maintained a clean criminal record, and always presented himself as polite to adults. His outward appearance and demeanor painted a picture of an ambitious young man, underestimated by some but clearly driven. After high school, Jeffrey pursued higher education and enrolled in nursing school. He chose a career in healthcare, a field grounded in trust and compassion, traits he effectively portrayed. He never completed an advanced degree, though his partial education helped him speak confidently about healthcare, impressing those less familiar with the field. In the early 2000s, Jeffrey moved to Philadelphia, a city full of educational institutions and professional opportunities. He rented a small apartment and began presenting himself as Dr. Jeff, weaving lies and truths together so seamlessly it was hard for others to discern reality. He constructed elaborate personas, portraying himself as a doctor, Navy officer, CIA agent, trauma surgeon, and even astronaut, tailoring his identity to suit his audience. His act was convincing, complete with props like stethoscopes, military gear, badges, NASA memorabilia, and forged documents, all reinforcing his false narratives. Jeffrey used online dating platforms like Match.com to extend his web of deception. His polished profile, featuring sharp photos and a veneer of sophistication, appealed to women seeking a successful, educated, and committed partner. He played the role flawlessly, presenting himself as the ideal match. To acquaintances, Jeffrey was a charismatic enigma. He could engage in discussions on a broad range of topics, from foreign policy to anatomy, military strategy, or romance, adjusting his charm based on his audience. He didn't come across as threatening, but rather as polished and intriguing. While he kept a low profile in public, he thrived in one-on-one interactions, where he dominated conversations and carefully controlled the narrative. Romantically, he had little trouble attracting partners. He claimed to be a doctor working at 3 of Philadelphia's top hospitals, a veteran of classified overseas missions, and a high-level intelligence operative with powerful connections in Washington. Although his stories were extravagant, his calm confidence often made people believe him. When questioned, he always had convincing explanations. Jeffrey told women he was restricted from sharing certain details due to national security concerns. His apartment featured just enough theatrics to make his stories believable: a fingerprint scanner on his computer, a CIA-themed screensaver, and files marked with terms like top secret or eyes only. To those meeting him for the first time, the combination of real-world elements and fantasy seemed plausible. However, beneath the facade, there were inconsistencies. He frequently changed jobs, showed little commitment to any single profession, and never finished his advanced education. His work history was inconsistent, but it didn't immediately raise suspicion. Jeffrey moved fluidly between social circles, blending in well enough to avoid scrutiny while standing out just enough to capture attention. When people met Jeffrey casually, they rarely noticed any discrepancies in his character. He appeared confident, successful, and composed, someone worth knowing. Women who went on dates with him often left impressed, feeling special and chosen. Jeffrey had a knack for quickly understanding people, figuring out what they wanted to hear, and delivering it. It wasn't just simple charm. It was a calculated strategy. Yet, behind his polished image, Jeffrey had no close friends and confided in no one. He was constantly on the move, reshaping his identity to fit the moment. Whether in Philadelphia or Idaho, the story was always the same: Dr. Jeff, a man with purpose, connections, and nothing that seemed worth questioning. But the truth was starkly different. Jeffrey was none of the things he claimed to be. He had no medical license, no military experience, and no credentials to support the image he meticulously curated. For years, no one saw through his act. He walked through life projecting the appearance of someone with it all together. Jeffrey controlled the narrative about himself. When women met him online, typically through Match.com, they believed him. He was polished, articulate, and educated, and low-key charming in a way that inspired trust. He didn't appear arrogant or controlling. On the contrary, he seemed caring, empathetic, and safe. But things were not as they seemed, and troubling patterns began to surface. Women who interacted with Jeffrey shared eerily similar stories. At first, he would send thoughtful messages and smoothly suggest meeting for drinks. Their first date often involved alcohol, wine, cocktails, or beer. He'd make engaging conversation, ask questions, and come across as a busy man truly invested in getting to know them. Each woman left feeling special, as though they'd been given a glimpse into his exciting, secretive life. The evening often ended with an invitation to his place or for just one more drink. Then everything went silent. All emotions stopped. Time passed, leaving behind an uneasy feeling. Many women reported waking up in an unfamiliar bed, naked, disoriented, and physically unwell. Sometimes Jeffrey was beside them. Other times, they were alone. Their clothing would be misarranged, their bodies would ache, and they'd have no memory of consenting, or even of what had happened. When they confronted him, he denied anything unusual. He would feign surprise or dismiss their concerns, saying that they had had too much to drink or that they had really been into it, and told them not to make it a big deal. Many people felt self-conscious, began to doubt themselves, tried to explain the situation, and hesitated to call the police. After all, Jeffrey was known as Dr. Jeff, a Navy veteran and trauma specialist. Who would believe otherwise about him? That all changed in 2005 when a young woman from Idaho, known as Jody, decided to speak up. Jody met Jeffrey while working at the Sun Valley Resort in Idaho, where he had relocated after initial allegations began to emerge in Philadelphia. At the resort, he worked as a security guard, not a doctor, but his lies continued. He claimed to be involved in military intelligence and hinted at a life filled with experiences most people couldn't imagine. Jody has no romantic interest in Jeffrey because she is openly gay. However, she accepts his invitation to have a drink as a friend because she believes she can trust him. That night, something went horribly wrong. After Jody left her beer unattended and later drank from it, she suddenly felt dizzy and disoriented. She tried to leave, but Jeffrey insisted on walking her home. She eventually passed out. The next morning, she woke up naked in an unfamiliar room, vomiting and feeling physically violated. Her memories were fragmented, but her instincts told her something terrible had happened. Meanwhile, Jeffrey acted as though nothing was wrong, calling her his little gay buddy and walking her back to her dorm. But Jody refused to ignore her intuition. She went to the hospital, contacted the police, and submitted to an abuse kit exam immediately. Unlike the women in Philadelphia, Jodi had physical evidence, DNA and medical documentation that confirmed her story. Meanwhile, in Philadelphia, the Special Victims Unit had already begun piecing together complaints against Jeffrey. Quiet investigations had started after one woman came forward months earlier. The more investigators dug, the more names emerged. Women from Match.com, as well as those he met socially, began to recount similar experiences. Over time, 21 women stepped forward, each with chillingly consistent accounts of how Jeffrey had deceived and harmed them. Detective Charlie Conway recalled the moment the pattern became evident. He said that those weren't isolated misunderstandings and that it was a clear and deliberate scheme. Evidence mounted when investigators found a spreadsheet on Jeffrey's computer titled Yearly Calendar of Women. It listed names, dates, places, and cryptic notes. A chilling record prosecutors believed documented his victims. In his Philadelphia apartment, police uncovered disturbing items: a bulletproof vest, a police baton, fake hospital IDs, medical equipment, and forged or stolen military and government documents, including Navy insignias and fake CIA credentials. Among his belongings were a fingerprint scanner and software imitating a classified government system. A framed NASA astronaut photo added to the collection of identities Jeffrey used to deceive. Victim stories followed a similar pattern. They described going on dates that ended in blackouts, waking up with no memory of what happened. Many felt trapped in shame, confusion, and disorientation. Shockingly, some continued seeing him, caught in cycles of manipulation and trauma. Jeffrey used not just drugs, but psychological control, breaking down their ability to consent. Prosecutors have faced significant challenges. Many victims come forward months or even years after the attack, leaving behind little physical evidence, such as banned substance test results, abuse kits, or witnesses. Cases often rely heavily on victim testimony. While this testimony is reliable, it is often insufficient to meet the high standard of proof in criminal cases. The case took a turn in 2006. Jeffrey was arrested in Sun Valley, Idaho, after a woman named Jodi reported him immediately. Her swift action, coupled with medical evidence from an abuse kit and visible injuries, strengthened the case against him. Authorities in Idaho collaborated with Philadelphia investigators, who were building their own case based on a pattern of accusations. When confronted, Jeffrey remained calm, denying all allegations. His defense attempted to cast him as a harmless ladies' man who was being targeted by regretful women. Prosecutors, however, focused on exposing his systematic deceit. In addition to charges of abuse and assault, Jeffrey also faced allegations of impersonating public officials, committing identity fraud, and obstructing justice. By masquerading as a doctor, soldier, or spy, he not only lured victims, but also used these personas to dominate and silence them. Meanwhile, victims began connecting with one another, forming a support network to share stories and timelines. Many said it was the first time they felt heard and validated. As Jeffrey awaited trial, the scale of his crimes became clearer. Over the years, he had meticulously planned his actions, refining his methods and keeping detailed records to avoid detection. Each victim thought she was alone, unaware of the full scope of his predation. By spring 2007, Jeffrey stood trial in a Philadelphia courtroom in one of the city's most disturbing serial abuse cases. Once regarded as a charismatic and educated professional, he is now facing charges, including abuse, from 7 separate victims. Despite this, the case posed challenges. Prosecutors had no physical evidence from the Philadelphia victims, no toxicology reports, no abuse kits, and no witnesses. What they did have were consistent, compelling testimonies from women who had never met each other, but shared the same harrowing stories. They described Jeffrey's charm, his offers of drinks, the unexplained blackouts, and waking up confused, violated, and ashamed. Assistant District Attorney Joe McGettigan built the case around this consistency, along with the damning spreadsheet found on Jeffrey's laptop. The yearly calendar of women provided names, dates, and chilling notes that painted a picture of systematic abuse. Prosecutors also introduced evidence of Jeffrey's fake identities, including a CIA badge, hospital IDs, and military props, used to manipulate and exploit his victims, one by one. The women testified. Many wept. Others trembled as they recounted their trauma. They spoke about sickness, helplessness, self-blame, and waking up disoriented with their clothes in disarray. Some admitted staying in touch with him afterward, explaining how psychological manipulation left them unable to confront their abuse. This emotional confusion became a focal point of the defense's argument. Defense attorney James Funt argued that all the encounters were consensual, claiming the accusers felt regret, not trauma. He highlighted the absence of timely police reports and pointed out inconsistencies in their recollections. The defense also noted the lack of medical evidence, arguing that in a case based solely on memories, doubt was unavoidable. Jeffrey sat silently in the courtroom, rarely showing emotion and occasionally smiling. He portrayed himself as a victim of a vendetta, targeted for his persona rather than his actions. His defense team insisted he never claimed to be a CIA agent or a doctor, arguing these were misunderstandings or exaggerations created by the women themselves. In March 2007, the verdict was announced. Jeffrey was acquitted of all charges except two, for which he was found guilty of abuse. His acquittal on the most serious charges shocked many, particularly the women who had risked everything to testify. While the partial conviction was a legal victory, it felt emotionally hollow. Jeffrey was released on bail. However, his legal troubles were far from over. In Idaho, Jeffrey faced a separate, much stronger case, built on physical evidence. In 2009, he was tried in Blaine County for the abuse of Jody, a 21-year-old woman who had immediately sought medical help and cooperated fully with law enforcement. This time, the prosecution had what was missing in Philadelphia: an abuse kit, DNA evidence, documented injuries, and a clear timeline. They presented expert witnesses and highlighted the consistency between Jody's account and stories told by women from the previous case. Jeffrey's history, detailed in his spreadsheet and patterns of behavior, was laid bare. Jody testified with precision, recounting the night she drank with Jeffrey, how she detected something granular in her beer, the disorientation that followed, and the terror of waking up naked beside him. Her testimony was clear, her fear undeniable. The defense once again argued that the encounter was consensual and claimed Jody had misinterpreted the situation. But the jury rejected their narrative. In 2009, Jeffrey was convicted of abuse in Idaho and sentenced to life in prison. For the first time, the justice system handed down a punishment that matched the severity of Jeffrey's crimes. Crimes many believed he had been committing for years. The courtroom in Idaho resounded with relief, a stark contrast to the frustration felt in Philadelphia 2 years earlier. Jeffrey's carefully constructed double life had crumbled. The man who once boasted about being a doctor, Navy SEAL, CIA operative, and even an astronaut, was now just another inmate. For the women who testified against him, the legal outcomes brought both vindication and lingering pain. In Philadelphia, his acquittal on the most serious charges devastated many. 21 women shared their stories, but their voices were not reflected in the final verdict. In Idaho, however, the guilty verdict and life sentence represented a long-awaited moment of accountability. For Jody, the survivor whose immediate actions and forensic evidence proved pivotal, it was more than a legal triumph, it was deeply personal. Her courage to speak out promptly and consistently made all the difference. Her case demonstrated what is possible when survivors are believed, supported, and protected by the justice system. The Jeffrey case stands as a chilling example of how image, privilege, and manipulation can allow someone to avoid accountability for years. He had no criminal record, dressed impeccably, and spoke with professionalism and authority. In a justice system often plagued by doubt and contradiction, these traits worked in his favor until they didn't. The case also reignited debates on how the legal system deals with dating abuse, especially when physical evidence is lacking. Prosecutors and victims' advocates highlighted the narrow definitions of proof and the challenges of pursuing cases where the weapon isn't a knife, but a drink. In court, women not only had to explain what happened to them, but were also scrutinized for how they reacted, how quickly they reported the crime, and whether their accounts were perfect enough to be believed. The case of Jeffrey Marsalis serves as a warning about the illusion of safety, how someone can be well-dressed, well-spoken, and still pose a threat. It underscores the cost of silence and the immense bravery required to come forward. Above all, it reminds us that predators don't always appear monstrous. Sometimes, they look like the man you met online, the one with the warm smile, whose story seemed just believable enough. Jeffrey's deception was widespread, but in the end, it wasn't enough to protect him. On the surface, November 18, 2010 looked like a normal Thursday morning in suburban Atlanta. The sky was clear, the air calm, and families were caught up in their usual morning routines, preparing lunches and hurrying to drop the kids off at school. In the Snyderman household, Rusty Snyderman was doing just that. After breakfast with his family, he kissed his wife goodbye, loaded his 2-year-old son Ian into the car, buckled him in, and drove to Dunwoody Prep, a small daycare center in a safe, middle-class neighborhood. Rusty, 36 years old, is a Harvard graduate entrepreneur. He has built a stable and successful life for his wife, Andrea, and their 2 children, Ian and Sophia. Friends described him as charming, loyal, energetic, and endlessly optimistic. He took great pride in his role as a father, always present and enthusiastic in caring for his children. But as he walked Ian into daycare that morning, an unseen danger was stalking him after dropping Ian off and exchanging pleasantries with other parents. Rusty made his way back to his car. Suddenly, the quiet morning shattered. A man emerged, raised a gun, and fired 3 shots at close range. One bullet struck Rusty in the neck, and he collapsed onto the asphalt as horrified parents and teachers froze in shock. Blood surrounded him as he lay motionless. He didn't scream or struggle. It was an abrupt, calculated killing. The shooter then calmly walked back to his silver van and drove away. Rusty died instantly, just steps from the daycare playground. Close enough for the children to hear, but his son Ian remained inside, safe and unaware that he'd just said goodbye to his father for the last time. The city of Dunwoody was in shock. Who would carry out such a bold and brutal murder in broad daylight, in front of children, and why? Who could want Rusty dead? As investigators delved into Rusty's life, they uncovered a web of secrets darker and more complex than anyone had imagined. It was a story entangled with infidelity, manipulation, obsession, and ultimately, murder. The truth unveiled a world where appearances were deceiving and no one could be trusted. Rusty Snyderman was born and raised in Cleveland, Ohio, in a close-knit, loving Jewish family. From an early age, he was marked by charm, humor, and kindness. As the youngest in his family, Rusty grew up surrounded by love, high expectations, and strong traditions. He thrived academically, but his greatest gift was the way he made others feel valued and understood. By his teenage years, Rusty had developed a knack for leadership. He organized school events, volunteered, and built enduring friendships. Success wasn't his sole pursuit. He earned respect through his compassion and determination. After graduating high school, Rusty went on to Indiana University, where he formed a lifelong bond with Josh Gollum, one of his closest friends. It was during these college years that Rusty's life took a defining turn. One evening, after a relaxing night out, Rusty meets a wonderful girl, Andrea Robin Greenberg. She is smart, ambitious, and very beautiful, and Rusty is instantly attracted to her. Their bond was intense from the start. Their relationship deepened quickly, with friends noting how hard and fast Rusty had fallen for her. After graduating, Rusty pursued an MBA at Harvard Business School, one of the most prestigious programs in the nation. He worked relentlessly, motivated by his dream of building a stable and meaningful life for his future family. After earning his degree, he married Andrea, and they moved to Atlanta, Georgia, to create the life they had long envisioned. Rusty embarked on a career in finance, eventually becoming a trusted wealth manager and business consultant. His clients valued his expertise, and his colleagues respected him. Rusty approached his work with integrity, prioritizing relationships over transactions. When Andrea gave birth to their daughter Sophia, followed by their son Ian, Rusty's sense of purpose deepened. In the suburban neighborhood of Dunwoody, the Snydermans were viewed as the picture-perfect American family. They were kind, friendly, and actively involved in the community. The kind of neighbors everyone was glad to have. Rusty took pride in their home and the life he and Andrea had built together. He adored Andrea and fully supported her aspirations. When Andrea decided to rejoin the workforce after spending time at home with their children, Rusty stood by her wholeheartedly. He encouraged her to apply for a position at General Electric GE, where she became a project manager and reported directly to a senior executive named Hemi Newman. Andrea's new job required frequent travel, including conferences, business trips, and late-night meetings. Rusty willingly took on more parenting responsibilities and remained proud of her achievements, confident in their relationship. But over time, things began to change. Andrea's travel increased, and she appeared more distracted and distant. Rusty still tried to support her, but it was hard for him to ignore some of the signs, like the late-night phone calls, the vague explanations, and the change in her demeanor. Despite these red flags, Rusty remained silent. He trusted Andrea and believed in the life they had built. Unbeknownst to Rusty, Andrea's professional relationship with her boss, Hemi Newman, had crossed a line. Hemi had grown infatuated with her, and their work lives began to overlap with their personal ones. At the time, Rusty was focused on his children and career. To outsiders, the Snydermans seemed like a stable, happy family. Behind closed doors, however, a dangerous dynamic was forming. One Rusty was entirely unaware of. The tragedy that followed didn't begin with a gunshot. It began with trust. Trust from a man who loved deeply, valued loyalty, and centered his life on family. Rusty had a thriving career, 2 beloved children, and a wife he deeply cherished. His life was full of meaning and joy, yet all of it would be snatched away in a devastating instant. The man responsible had already entered their lives. Hemi Newman wasn't someone who instantly raised red flags. On paper, he is an experienced, intelligent engineer who takes on a leadership role at General Electric Energy in Atlanta, where he manages more than 5,000 employees. Colleagues described him as intelligent, confident, and occasionally arrogant. But beneath his polished facade, Hemi was unraveling. Though married with 2 children, his personal life was far from stable. Outwardly, he seemed successful, but privately, he was grappling with unhappiness. His marriage was crumbling, financial stress was mounting, and he appeared emotionally lost. His wife began to suspect him when he became cold, irritable, and unapproachable. And then Andrea entered his life. Andrea Snyderman stood out at GE from the beginning. She was attractive, confident, and articulate. A woman who excelled in meetings, traveled seamlessly, and carried herself with ease. She laughed freely and admired Hemi in a way that felt absent in his own marriage, and he became captivated by her. Initially, Hemi and Andrea's relationship was purely business. However, over time, it evolved. First subtly, then intensely. They spent countless hours collaborating on presentations, attending conferences, and often sharing meals or drinks at hotel bars after meetings. Their work travels took them to places like Lake Tahoe, Denver, London, and even Edinburgh Castle in Scotland. To those around them, their connection seemed far more personal than business-related. Andrea later denied having an affair. She claimed that Hemi's feelings were unrequited, that she only saw him as a friend, and any closeness was misinterpreted. However, others have a different perspective. According to them, this relationship is emotional, flirtatious, and sometimes goes further, beyond work boundaries. Meanwhile, Rusty remained oblivious. Though aware of Andrea's frequent travel, he trusted her deeply. However, in the days leading up to his murder, Rusty grew uneasy. He noticed a suspicious man lingering near their home, a man wearing a hat, a fake mustache, and earmuffs. Alarmed by the man's presence, Rusty called 911. Rusty mentioned to the operator that he thought the man had a gun in his back pocket. His voice was steady but anxious, as he explained that he didn't know who the man was, but emphasized that he didn't want the man near his house. What Rusty couldn't know was that the stranger outside was Hemi, in disguise, preparing to kill him. 8 days later, Hemi followed Rusty to the Dunwoody Prep Daycare Center, where Hemi shot him at point-blank range in front of horrified parents and teachers. How did a successful and respected executive become a murderer? The answer reveals disturbing complexities. In police custody, Hemi confessed to the murder but claimed that he wasn't in control of his actions. He explained that he suffered from hallucinations and hearing voices. One voice, resembling Barry White, urged him to kill himself. Investigators were shocked. Hemi's calm demeanor during the interrogation added to their unease. Despite his claims of mental illness, he appeared composed, methodical, and even rehearsed. While admitting to the crime, he attempted to frame it as a result of psychological turmoil. Throughout the interrogation, one name kept surfacing: Andrea. Hemi told police that he was in love with her, believing they were soulmates. He described how she confided in him about her troubled marriage, and how their emotional connection gave him hope for a future together. Andrea, however, denied any romantic involvement. She stated that Hemi had overstepped boundaries making unwanted advances, which she had firmly rejected. She maintained that she only saw him as a colleague, but Hemi's phone records contradicted her claims. In the 6 months leading up to Rusty's murder, Andrea and Hemi exchanged more than 400 calls and text messages. Their emails suggested emotional, if not romantic, intimacy. In one such email, Hemi even proposed marriage. Andrea dismissed this as silly and inappropriate, testifying that she had told him to stop and made it clear his advances were unwelcome. Yet, she had allowed him into her hotel room during work trips, traveled alone with him, confided in him, arranged to pick him up from the airport, and even moved her seat on planes to sit beside him. She never mentioned any of this to Rusty. Hemi's wife, Ariella Newman, also felt that the relationship was not strictly professional. Ariella eventually filed for separation, but by then, it was too late. Hemi had already purchased the .40 caliber handgun that would ultimately end Rusty's life. A gun dealer later testified that Hemi had approached him, claiming he needed a firearm for home protection. After the murder, Hemi contacted the same dealer again, this time to ask about how to dispose of the gun for the police. It became evident that Hemi's obsession had taken a dark and deadly turn. As investigators assembled the case, one key question remained: was he acting alone? Did Andrea manipulate Hemi into murdering her husband? Did she feed his delusions, fuel his obsession, and make him believe that her husband Rusty was the only obstacle keeping them apart? Or was she an innocent bystander caught up in the chaos of a man spiraling out of control? Andrea had claimed she didn't know Rusty had been shot until she arrived at the hospital, around 11 a.m., but phone records showed she had called Rusty's father at 9:36 a.m., less than 30 minutes after the shooting, and told him that Rusty had been shot. How did she know no one had told her? Police hadn't released that information yet. Her own testimony contradicted what she had told Rusty's family. Rusty's father would later testify in court, visibly emotional, confirming that Andrea had called and said that Rusty had been shot and that she was heading to Dunwoody Prep to find out what had happened. If Andrea didn't know, why would she say that? Prosecutors were beginning to suspect that Andrea wasn't just a grieving widow. Maybe she knew more than she let on. Maybe she hadn't pulled the trigger. But had she played a part? As Hemi sat in jail awaiting trial, investigators uncovered more receipts, rental records, gun purchases. By January 2011, Hemi was charged with murder. But the question hanging over the case was no longer just about who pulled the trigger. The real question was who else knew. More than a year after the murder of Rusty Snyderman, the case finally arrived in a courtroom. The DeKalb County Courthouse was packed. Reporters, legal observers, family members, all watched as the man accused of gunning down a young father at a daycare center stood trial. Hemi had confessed to pulling the trigger. Now, he wasn't fighting to prove he was innocent. He was fighting to prove he was insane. At the center of the defense strategy was one claim: Hemi wasn't in his right mind when he murdered Rusty. He was mentally ill, lost in delusions, manipulated by voices, and incapable of knowing right from wrong. His lawyers entered a plea of not guilty due to insanity. The prosecution, however, contended the opposite. He was sane, calculated, and dangerously obsessed. This was not a breakdown. It was a betrayal fueled by infatuation and selfish desire. During opening statements, the courtroom heard a bizarre explanation that completely changed the way the trial was perceived. Hemi's lawyers said he had been hearing voices for weeks before the murder. One deep, masculine voice, like Barry White's, repeatedly encouraged him to kill himself. Meanwhile, another soft, gentle voice, like Olivia Newton-John, instructed him to kill Rusty, saying that Rusty was a danger to his children. Hemi claimed that he truly believed he was protecting the Rusty's children. The story was so bizarre that it seemed beyond belief. The jury was silent, and even seasoned reporters could not hide their disbelief. A psychiatrist testified that Hemi suffered from bipolar disorder with psychotic features and was experiencing a manic, delusional episode when he committed the crime. Another expert supported this diagnosis, stating that Hemi's grip on reality had been unraveling for months, but the prosecution rejected this narrative entirely. To them, the voices were a fabrication, a calculated act. They didn't see a man spiraling out of control. They saw someone meticulously planning a murder, renting a car under a false identity, donning a disguise, driving across town, waiting, shooting, leaving. All of it pointed to premeditation. The prosecution also highlighted how Hemi deceived those around him. To them, this wasn't about mental illness. It was about jealousy, rejection, and unfulfilled desire. They argued that the true motivation behind the murder wasn't insanity. It was Andrea. The tension in the courtroom peaked when Andrea took the stand. She appeared different from before, polished and distant. Some described her as composed, while others saw arrogance in her demeanor. Andrea was asked directly if she had ever been romantically involved with Hemi, and she replied that she had not. The prosecution was prepared for this response. They presented a series of emails filled with emotionally charged messages. In one, Hemi pleaded with her to marry him. Others described shared moments, stargazing, waking up together in Denver, and walking hand in hand in Edinburgh. Andrea denied any romantic involvement, claiming that he had been infatuated, that she had tried to handle it, and that she had never encouraged it. Her testimony, however, only raised more questions. She admitted to letting Hemi into her hotel room during work trips, but maintained it was always innocent. She also admitted she never told her husband, Rusty, about Hemi's advances. Even after realizing Hemi had feelings for her, she continued to travel with him, sit beside him on flights, and take his late-night calls. The boundary between professional and personal was hopelessly blurred. When questioned about why she hadn't disclosed the nature of her relationship with Hemi to the police, Andrea said she didn't think it was relevant. But that explanation didn't sit well, neither with the prosecution nor the jury. Suspicion deepened when Rusty's father testified that Andrea had called him less than 30 minutes after the shooting and said Rusty had been shot, a fact that hadn't yet been made public. Andrea had previously claimed she didn't know about the shooting until she arrived at the hospital. Her timeline didn't add up. The prosecution seized on this inconsistency. If Andrea knew about the shooting before anyone told her, how did she know? Did Hemi warn her in advance? Did she already know it was going to happen? These questions hung heavily in the courtroom, unsettling the jury. The murder case with signs of insanity initially seemed simple, but then it became much more complicated and confusing. The defense reminded the jury that this trial was not about Andrea. Hemi was the one facing a life sentence. They repeatedly focused on Hemi's troubled past, including an abusive father and years of emotional instability. The defense argued that while Andrea may have been emotionally careless, it was Hemi who ultimately lost control. The prosecution, however, was relentless. In their closing arguments, they portrayed Hemi not as psychotic, but as calculated. They ridiculed the suggestion that voices compelled Hemi to act, mocking the idea that hearing songs by Barry White and Olivia Newton-John could justify a premeditated murder. The jury swiftly arrived at a verdict after thoroughly reviewing the evidence and testimony. Hemi Newman was declared guilty but mentally ill. The judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole, guaranteeing he would remain incarcerated for the rest of his life. Andrea called the verdict a relief and described her late husband, Rusty, as an amazing man. Yet the trial had permanently altered how the public viewed her. The inconsistent testimony, coupled with her behavior and relationship with Hemi, her husband's killer, created a lingering suspicion that she could not shake. Justice came with complications. Hemi Newman would spend the rest of his life in prison, held responsible for killing Rusty Snyderman while grappling with mental illness. For Rusty's family, the verdict brought some sense of closure, but true peace remained elusive. Andrea was never charged with murder. Although she was initially charged, prosecutors later dropped the most serious charges because there was not enough evidence to clearly and convincingly prove her involvement. Instead, she was convicted of perjury and obstruction for lying under oath and misleading investigators. She served time in prison, but not for her husband's death. Looking at this tragic case that shook a college community to its core, we need to examine how a promising young nursing student's life was cut short by someone she thought she could trust. Tonight, we're diving deep into the murder of Haley Anderson, a case that would span 2 countries and raise questions about justice, obsession, and the warning signs we sometimes choose to ignore. It was March 2018 when 22-year-old Haley Anderson disappeared from her off-campus apartment near Binghamton University. What started as concern among friends quickly escalated into a nightmare that would expose the dark side of a relationship gone terribly wrong. Haley Anderson embodied everything you'd expect from a dedicated nursing student approaching graduation. Her friends described her as a free spirit with an infectious energy that drew people to her. She was the type of person who trusted everyone she met, always seeing the good in people even when others warned her to be more cautious. This trusting nature would ultimately become both her greatest strength and her fatal weakness. Born and raised in Westbury, New York, Haley had worked tirelessly throughout her college years to achieve her dream of becoming a nurse. By March 2018, graduation was just around the corner, and she had already secured a nursing position back home. Her mother, Karen, was planning a celebration party, excited to have her daughter close again after years of college life upstate. But Haley's plans extended far beyond that first job. She dreamed of traveling to California, buying a hippie van, and working as a traveling nurse while exploring the country. It was a plan that perfectly captured her adventurous spirit and desire for freedom. At Binghamton University, Haley had cultivated a close group of friends who became like family to her. She lived in an off-campus apartment with roommates who knew her daily routines, her habits, and most importantly, when something was wrong. Among her social circle was Kevin Ocampo, her on and off boyfriend who genuinely loved her but understood that Haley wasn't ready for a serious commitment. She had made it clear that she wanted to experience freedom after graduation before settling down with anyone. It was through Kevin that Haley first encountered Orlando Tercero, a fellow nursing student who would eventually become the center of this tragic story. Orlando was born in Miami but raised in Nicaragua, coming from a well-to-do family with medical connections. His father was a physician, which likely influenced Orlando's decision to pursue nursing. By all accounts, he was a good student who worked hard during the week and enjoyed socializing on weekends. The initial meeting between Haley and Orlando happened in their nursing classes, but they didn't really connect until a party at Kevin's apartment during Haley's 4th year. Orlando and Kevin bonded over their shared Hispanic background and ability to speak Spanish, leading Kevin to invite Orlando to join his fraternity. What began as a friendship between the three of them gradually shifted into something more complicated. When Haley and Kevin took one of their breaks, Orlando crossed a line by pursuing Haley romantically. This created tension within their friend group, especially when Orlando's fraternity brothers pushed him out for getting involved with Kevin's girlfriend. The relationship between Haley and Orlando developed into its own on and off dynamic. Friends described their interactions as volatile, ranging from hysterical laughter to heated arguments. Sometimes they would avoid each other for weeks. Other times, Orlando would be staying over at Haley's apartment. But according to those closest to the situation, Haley had been crystal clear from the beginning that she didn't want a committed relationship with Orlando. She was focused on finishing school and maintaining her independence. Orlando, however, seemed to have different ideas about where their relationship was heading. Haley's roommate Josie began noticing concerning behavior from Orlando. He would show up at their apartment uninvited, sometimes just to smoke a cigarette on their porch. He would drive by their house repeatedly, and Josie often found herself in the position of having to ask him to leave because Haley found it difficult to be direct with him herself. The red flags became impossible to ignore when jealousy entered the picture. Orlando clearly struggled with the fact that Haley was seeing other people and maintaining her relationship with Kevin. His possessive behavior began escalating in ways that should have been warning signs to everyone involved. Friends described Orlando as charismatic and fun to be around, someone who knew how to make people laugh and enjoy themselves. But beneath that charm was a growing obsession with Haley that became more apparent as time went on. The situation reached a disturbing turning point when Haley's tires were slashed. It happened the day after a party at Orlando's apartment, where he learned that Haley and Kevin were back together. When Haley walked Kevin out to his car the next morning, they discovered the damage. Kevin immediately suspected Orlando, and so did Haley's mother Karen when she heard about the incident. The damage was significant, over $600 worth, which would have made it a felony charge. Despite pressure from her family to file a police report and press charges, Haley refused. She was concerned that a felony conviction would get Orlando kicked out of the nursing program. This decision perfectly illustrated Haley's compassionate nature, but it also demonstrated how Orlando had manipulated her feelings of guilt and sympathy. Friends later revealed that Orlando would often make statements about wanting to harm himself, using emotional manipulation to keep Haley involved in his life even when she tried to distance herself. Despite the tire-slashing incident and the warnings from friends and family, Haley eventually allowed Orlando back into her life. Her trusting nature and genuine care for others made it difficult for her to completely cut ties with someone she had once cared about. The months following the tire incident were marked by this same pattern of Orlando's concerning behavior, followed by Haley's reluctant forgiveness. Her friends watched with growing alarm as the cycle continued, but Haley remained convinced that she could handle the situation. None of them could have predicted how deadly that situation would become. As March 2018 arrived, Haley was focused on her final semester and upcoming graduation. She had been spending time with her roommates, enjoying normal college activities like playing board games and sharing wine on quiet evenings. These were the moments that would later take on profound significance as the last peaceful memories her friends had of her. On the evening of March 7th, Haley had what would be her final normal night with her roommates. They stayed up late together, talking and laughing as college friends do. When they went to bed that night, none of them realized it would be the last time they would see Haley alive. The next morning brought an eerie silence that her roommates initially dismissed. Haley loved to sleep in, so when she didn't respond to text messages right away, no one was immediately concerned. College students often have irregular schedules, and it wasn't unusual for someone to be unreachable for a few hours. But as March 8th wore on with no word from Haley, that initial lack of concern began transforming into genuine worry. By Thursday, March 8th, when Haley failed to show up at poetry night, where she had promised to watch her friend perform, the concern among her circle intensified dramatically. Multiple attempts to reach her by phone went unanswered, which was completely out of character for someone who stayed in constant communication with her friends and family. Her roommates began piecing together the timeline of the previous evening, trying to understand when they had last seen or heard from Haley. The realization that she had been missing for over 24 hours without any contact sent alarm bells ringing through their tight-knit group. Meanwhile, back in Westbury, Karen Anderson remained unaware that anything was wrong. She and Haley had an agreement that they would talk every Sunday, respecting her daughter's independence while maintaining their close relationship. It was still early in the week, so Karen had no reason to suspect that her daughter was in danger. The breakthrough in locating Haley came through modern technology and the quick thinking of her roommates. One of them remembered that Haley had shared her location through the Find My Friends app on her phone. When they checked the app, it showed that Haley's phone was at Orlando's apartment. This discovery shifted the search from a general missing person case to a focused investigation at a specific location. The roommates made the decision to go to Orlando's apartment and see if they could find their friend. When they arrived at the house where Orlando lived, they knocked on all the doors, but received no response. Orlando's car was also missing from the property, which seemed to confirm that no one was home. However, the fact that Haley's phone was showing as being inside the apartment created an urgent need to investigate further. Faced with locked doors and growing fear for their friend's safety, the roommates made the difficult decision to climb through a window to gain entry to the apartment. This wasn't a decision they made lightly, but their concern for Haley outweighed their reservations about entering someone else's home without permission. What they discovered inside would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The roommate who entered first immediately screamed for the others to call 911. In Orlando's bedroom, they found Haley's lifeless body. She appeared pale and motionless, and even though they hoped against hope that she might still be alive, it was clear that something terrible had happened. The police response was immediate and comprehensive. Within minutes of the 911 call, the house was swarming with officers, investigators, and medical personnel. The scene quickly transformed from a college rental house into an active crime scene. Initial examination revealed that Haley had been strangled to death. The position of her body and the condition of the room suggested that the attack had been intimate and personal. There were no signs of forced entry or robbery, pointing towards someone she knew and trusted. Most significantly, Orlando was nowhere to be found. As investigators began processing the crime scene, they discovered a wealth of evidence that would help them piece together the timeline of events. The house was equipped with multiple security cameras that had captured movements both inside and outside the property. The camera footage revealed a chilling sequence of events that began in the early morning hours of March 8th. The first significant recording showed Haley and Orlando walking into the residence together. This would be the last time Haley was seen alive on any recording. After entering the apartment with Haley, Orlando was captured on camera leaving the residence multiple times over the following hours. However, Haley never appeared on any subsequent footage, suggesting that she never left the apartment after their initial arrival together. The timeline established by the security cameras painted a disturbing picture of Orlando's activities in the hours following Haley's death, rather than immediately calling for help or reporting what had happened. He appeared to be methodically planning his next moves. Investigators tracked Orlando's movements through various pieces of evidence found in his apartment. A receipt led them to a local pharmacy where security footage showed him purchasing sleeping aids including Zizquil and melatonin. This purchase occurred several hours after Haley's estimated time of death, suggesting he was attempting to cope with what he had done or prepare for his own suicide. The evidence suggested that Orlando returned to his apartment after the pharmacy visit and remained there for approximately 7 more hours. During this time, investigators believe he attempted to take his own life by hanging himself in the basement of the house. Physical evidence supported this theory. Officers found blood on the basement floor and a tie hanging from a doorway, along with hooks that could have been used in a suicide attempt. It appeared that Orlando had tried to hang himself but had fallen and injured himself in the process, explaining the blood evidence. Perhaps most damning was a handwritten note found in the apartment, written in Spanish. The note began with "Lamento mucho esto," which translates to "I'm really sorry about this." Orlando continued by writing that he never felt he could be capable of doing such a thing, and ended with "Father, I'll see you soon," a reference to his deceased father. This note served as both a confession and what appeared to be a suicide note, providing investigators with clear evidence of Orlando's guilt and his mental state following the crime. However, instead of following through with his apparent suicide plan, Orlando made a different choice. Approximately 16 hours before Haley's body was discovered by her roommates, security cameras captured Orlando leaving his apartment one final time, this time carrying luggage, with his head bandaged, likely from his failed suicide attempt. Orlando drove more than 3 hours to New York's JFK Airport. There, he boarded a plane that would take him back to his home country of Nicaragua, where he held dual citizenship. This flight represented Orlando's attempt to escape justice by fleeing to a country where extradition would prove complicated. His dual citizenship status meant that Nicaragua was not required to send him back to the United States to face charges, creating a potential legal nightmare for prosecutors. When District Attorney Steve Cornwell learned that Orlando had successfully fled to Nicaragua before they could arrest him, his first thought was the devastating possibility that a killer might have escaped justice permanently. The complexities of international law and extradition treaties meant that bringing Orlando back to face trial would be far from guaranteed. The case now required coordination between multiple law enforcement agencies, international cooperation, and navigation of complex legal frameworks that many local prosecutors rarely encounter. What had begun as a local murder investigation was about to become an international pursuit of justice. Meanwhile, the devastating news of Haley's death reached her family in the most heartbreaking way possible. Karen Anderson was at home when she noticed 2 men in a black car parked outside her house. When they approached her door and asked to speak with her, she knew immediately that something was terribly wrong. The officers sat her down and delivered the news that no parent ever wants to hear. They told her that Haley had been found dead, that she had been strangled, and that the primary suspect had fled the country. In that moment, Karen's world completely collapsed. The guilt and regret hit her immediately. She remembered the tire slashing incident and her insistence that Haley should have pressed charges against Orlando. She wondered if her daughter would still be alive if they had taken that threat more seriously, if they had recognized the warning signs for what they truly were. The international hunt for Orlando Tercero intensified as Nicaraguan authorities worked to locate the fugitive. Within days of his flight from New York, Orlando was tracked to his hometown of Chinandega, Nicaragua, where he had been hiding with family members. The political climate in Nicaragua complicated matters, but eventually, local police apprehended him at a hospital where he was receiving treatment for his self-inflicted injuries. A dramatic press conference in Managua showcased Orlando in custody, confirming to the world that he had been captured. However, Capturing him was only the beginning of what would become a prolonged legal battle spanning two countries and two very different justice systems. District Attorney Cornwell initially pushed for extradition, hoping to bring Orlando back to New York to face second-degree murder charges. For over a year, diplomatic channels worked to secure his return, but the dual citizenship issue proved insurmountable. Nicaragua's constitution prohibited extraditing its own citizens, regardless of existing treaties with the United States. In September 2019, Cornwell received the call that would change everything. The Department of Justice delivered mixed news. Nicaragua would not extradite Orlando, but they were willing to prosecute him under their own legal system. While this wasn't the outcome anyone had hoped for, it represented Haley's family's only chance at seeing some form of justice. The charges in Nicaragua were different from what Orlando would have faced in New York. Instead of second-degree murder, he was charged with femicide, a specific crime recognizing the murder of women by men with whom they had relationships. This charge carried a maximum sentence of 30 years in prison. What followed was an unprecedented legal proceeding that would test the limits of international cooperation. The entire trial was conducted through video conferencing, with witnesses testifying from the Broome County District Attorney's Office to a courtroom in Managua, thousands of miles away. Karen Anderson became the first witness, finally coming face-to-face with her daughter's killer through a computer screen. The technology allowed her to see Orlando's reaction as she testified about the warning signs they had all witnessed, his possessive behavior, and the devastating impact of losing Haley. One by one, Haley's friends and roommates shared their stories with the Nicaraguan court. They described Orlando's obsessive behavior, the tire-slashing incident, and his pattern of showing up uninvited at their apartment. The surveillance footage from Orlando's house was presented as evidence, showing the timeline of events that led to Haley's death. The medical examiner's testimony was particularly crucial, establishing that Haley had died from strangulation, with specific injuries consistent with manual compression of her neck. The intimate nature of the attack reinforced the prosecution's argument that this was a crime of passion committed by someone Haley knew and trusted. Orlando's defense team argued that he had been temporarily insane at the time of the murder, claiming he had no memory of the events due to alcohol consumption. They brought in a court-appointed psychiatrist who testified that Orlando claimed to have woken up after a night of heavy drinking to find Haley dead. However, this defense strategy fell apart under scrutiny. There was no evidence that Orlando had been intoxicated to the point of temporary insanity, and the deliberate nature of his actions afterwards suggested clear thinking and planning. The handwritten note he left behind demonstrated his awareness of what he had done. The trial moved swiftly by Nicaraguan standards, concluding after just a few days of testimony. When the judge returned from deliberation after only 90 minutes, everyone was surprised by the speed of the decision. The verdict was unequivocal: guilty of femicide. In her sentencing remarks, the judge delivered a powerful statement about violence against women and the importance of recognizing femicide as a serious crime. She noted that Orlando had taken it upon himself to punish Haley for rejecting him, attempting to control her through the ultimate act of violence. Orlando received the maximum sentence of 30 years in prison, a decision that brought some measure of closure to Haley's family and friends. While nothing could bring Haley back, seeing her killer held accountable provided a sense that justice had been served. The case established important precedents for international cooperation in domestic violence cases and highlighted the serious nature of femicide as a distinct crime. It also demonstrated how modern technology, from security cameras to phone tracking apps, can provide crucial evidence in solving murders. For Haley's family, The conclusion of the trial marked the end of one chapter in their grief journey, but the beginning of another focused on healing and honoring her memory. They established initiatives to raise awareness about domestic violence warning signs and the importance of taking threats seriously. Karen Anderson became an advocate for femicide legislation in the United States, hoping that Haley's story might help prevent similar tragedies. She spoke openly about the guilt she carried for not pushing harder for charges after the tire-slashing incident, hoping other families might learn from their experience. The friends who discovered Haley's body continue to carry the trauma of that day, but they also carry forward her memory through their own nursing careers and advocacy work. They remember her as the free-spirited, trusting person who saw good in everyone, even when that trust ultimately betrayed her. Orlando remains imprisoned in Nicaragua's overcrowded penitentiary system, where he will likely spend the next 3 decades. If he ever attempts to return to American soil, he still faces second-degree murder charges in New York State, ensuring that his debt to justice extends far beyond his current sentence. This case serves as a stark reminder that domestic violence warning signs should never be ignored. That obsessive behavior can escalate to deadly violence, and that the people closest to us are sometimes the ones who pose the greatest danger. Haley Anderson's story is ultimately one of a bright future stolen by someone who couldn't accept that love cannot be forced or controlled. Her legacy lives on through the lives she would have saved as a nurse, the awareness her case has raised about femicide, and the determination of those who loved her to ensure that her death has meaning beyond the senseless act that ended her life. In 1979, on what seemed like a perfect summer evening, a 9-year-old girl's life changed forever. One moment she was watching television and laughing at a comedy show. The next, she was learning that someone wanted her entire family dead. This is the story of the Busby family, whose year of terror began with a single shotgun blast that shattered more than just a car window. It destroyed their sense of safety, their home, and forced them into a life they never imagined possible. Picture this. It's August 31st, 1979, the Friday before Labor Day weekend. The Busby family is spending their evening in the driveway, painting a car while the summer sun sets over Cape Cod. 9-year-old Silent Busby has no idea this will be the last normal moment of her childhood. Her father, John Busby, is getting ready for his midnight shift as a police sergeant in Falmouth, Massachusetts. Everything seems ordinary, peaceful even, but in small towns like Falmouth, ordinary can become extraordinary in the span of a heartbeat. And sometimes, that heartbeat stops altogether. John Busby wasn't just any police officer. He was the kind of cop who didn't care about your connections, your family name, or how much money you had. If you broke the law, you faced the consequences, period. This unwavering commitment to justice had earned him respect from honest citizens and hatred from those who thought they were above the law. Unfortunately for the Busby family, one of those people had decided that John Busby needed to be silenced permanently. As John drove to work that night, less than half a mile from his house, a car pulled up behind him. At first, it seemed like any other vehicle on the road, but then it pulled alongside his Volkswagen, matching his speed. In that moment, John realized this wasn't a normal traffic situation. Someone was hunting him. The blast from the shotgun tore through the driver's side window with devastating force. The impact ripped through John's face, destroying his lower jaw and leaving him barely conscious. But in those crucial seconds before darkness took hold, he managed to do something that would save his family's lives. He wrote 2 words that would change everything, not an accident. John Busby knew instantly who wanted him dead. He'd crossed paths with dangerous people before, but one name stood out above all others. Someone who had a reputation for making problems disappear, sometimes along with the people who caused them. Someone who had been suspected in multiple disappearances and murders but had never been held accountable. Someone whose favorite saying was, "I smell smoke," which wasn't a comment about the weather, but a thinly veiled threat that your property might mysteriously catch fire. Meanwhile, back at the Busby house, 9-year-old Silen was settling in for what she thought would be a normal evening. She was watching Benny Hill on television, laughing at the comedy sketches, completely unaware that her father was fighting for his life just minutes away. Her mother, Polly, was studying to become a nurse. Her 2 older brothers, Eric and Sean, were probably getting ready for bed. Their cousin Kelly, who helped with babysitting duties, was keeping an eye on things. Then came the knock at the door that shattered their world. When Silen heard someone crying or screaming, she initially thought it was coming from the television. But as the sounds continued, she realized something was terribly wrong. She came out of her room to find her father's colleague, Rick Smith, in uniform, speaking to her mother who was crying and screaming, repeatedly saying no, 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 and trying to push him away. The confusion was overwhelming. Nobody was explaining what had happened. There was just chaos, fear, and the terrible realization that something had gone catastrophically wrong. Silen stood there, asking what was happening. But the adults were too consumed by their own shock and panic to notice her. What Silen didn't know yet was that her father was lying in a hospital bed, unable to speak, unable to breathe on his own, but very much alive and very much aware of who had tried to kill him. What she also didn't know was that this shooting wasn't just about her father. It was about sending a message to anyone who dared to challenge certain people in their small town. And if those people were willing to shoot a police officer, they certainly wouldn't hesitate to finish the job by eliminating his family. The note John managed to write in his hospital bed contained more than just the words, "Not an accident." He also wrote, "Polly and the kids are not safe." This wasn't the rambling of a man in shock. This was the clear, calculated warning of someone who understood exactly what kind of enemy they were dealing with. In Falmouth, Massachusetts, there was one person everyone knew you didn't cross. Melvin Rain was in the trash hauling business, which might sound harmless enough, but his methods of dealing with competition and problems were anything but ordinary. He was a convicted arsonist with a reputation for getting even with people by sneaking around at night and burning their property, houses, cars, businesses. If Melvin had a problem with you, something you owned might mysteriously go up in flames. But arson was just the beginning. Melvin was also suspected of murder. Not one murder, not 2, but 3 separate cases where people had disappeared or turned up dead under suspicious circumstances. His own wife, Wanda, had vanished in 1971 after he claimed to have dropped her off at a bus station. She was never seen again. A teenage boy who had been dating a girl Melvin was interested in was found shot to death in a cranberry bog directly across from Melvin's house. A 17-year-old former employee who was set to testify against Melvin in a grand jury investigation got on a ferry to Martha's Vineyard but never got off. In each case, Melvin walked free. The pattern was always the same. People who crossed him or posed a threat to him seemed to disappear or meet unfortunate ends. But there was never enough evidence to charge him. Or perhaps, there were people in positions of power who were too afraid to go after him. This was the man John Busby had been willing to confront when others wouldn't. This was the man who had decided that a police officer who couldn't be bought, threatened, or intimidated needed to be eliminated. And this was the man who now posed an ongoing threat to a family that included 3 young children. Back at the hospital, doctors were working frantically to save John's life. The damage was so severe that they had never seen anything like it. His face was unrecognizable. His jaw was gone, and he couldn't speak, breathe, or eat without mechanical assistance. But he was alive, and he was determined to stay that way for one reason: his family needed him to survive so he could protect them from what was coming next. Because this story wasn't over. In fact, it was just beginning. As the Busby family tried to process what had happened, the reality of their situation began to sink in. This wasn't a random act of violence. This wasn't a case of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Someone had specifically targeted John Busby for elimination, and that same someone would likely not be satisfied with a failed attempt. The police response was immediate and overwhelming. Within hours of the shooting, the Busby house was surrounded by law enforcement. Squad cars filled the driveway. Officers with rifles took positions around the property. The message was clear. This family was now under siege, and everyone understood that the danger was far from over. For 9-year-old Silen, the transformation was jarring. One day, she was a normal kid living in a normal house on Cape Cod. The next day, armed guards were stationed outside her bedroom window. Police officers followed her to school, sat outside her classroom, and watched her eat lunch. Every movement was monitored. Every person who came near her was scrutinized. The psychological impact on the children was immediate and profound. At school, word spread quickly about what had happened. Some children were curious, others were frightened, and many were simply told by their parents to stay away from the Busby kids. Silen found herself sitting alone at lunch tables, excluded from playground games, and treated like a walking target. One particularly cruel classmate even told her directly that everyone knew someone was trying to kill her family and that they might be next. The family's home became a fortress. An 8-foot fence was erected around the property. A sophisticated alarm system was installed. Windows were covered. Doors remained locked at all times. The family dog, Tiger, was given away and replaced with Max, a trained attack dog whose sole purpose was to eliminate any threat to John Busby or his family. Max wasn't a pet. He was a weapon with 4 legs and a set of teeth designed to kill. But perhaps the most unsettling change was in John himself. When he finally came home from the hospital months later, he was a different person entirely. The injuries to his face were so severe that he was barely recognizable. His jaw had been reconstructed, but the damage went far beyond the physical. The man who had once been playful and affectionate with his children now seemed emotionally distant. The father who used to roughhouse and tell jokes had been replaced by someone who was constantly vigilant, always watching, always planning. The financial burden on the family was crushing. John's compensation for being shot in the line of duty was $200 per week. Hardly enough to support a family of 5, let alone a family that needed round-the-clock security. The town of Falmouth was spending enormous amounts of money on police protection, and it was becoming clear that this arrangement couldn't continue indefinitely. Meanwhile, the investigation into the shooting was going nowhere. Despite John's clear indication of who was responsible, despite the obvious motive, and despite Melvin Rain's history of violence, no arrests were made, no charges were filed, no justice was served. It was as if the shooting had never happened, at least from an official standpoint. This lack of action wasn't just frustrating, it was terrifying. If the police couldn't or wouldn't go after the person who had tried to murder one of their own officers, What protection could they really offer his family? The Busbys were living in a state of constant fear, never knowing when the next attempt on their lives might come. John's anger was building to dangerous levels. In his hospital bed, he had initially focused on survival and recovery. But as the months passed and it became clear that no official justice would be forthcoming, his thoughts turned to a different kind of solution. He began to contemplate taking matters into his own hands. The idea of hunting down Melvin Rain and finishing what had been started that night in August became more than just a fantasy. It became a plan. The family was trapped in a nightmare that seemed to have no end. They couldn't live normally because of the constant threat. They couldn't rely on the justice system because it had failed them completely. They couldn't even trust their own community because too many people were either afraid of Melvin Rain or somehow connected to him. As winter turned to spring and spring turned to summer, it became increasingly clear that something had to change. The Busby family couldn't continue living as prisoners in their own home. The town couldn't continue spending money on protection that might not even be effective. And John couldn't continue to heal, physically or emotionally, while surrounded by daily reminders of the violence that had been done to him. The solution, when it finally came, was as drastic as it was necessary. If the Busby family couldn't be safe in Falmouth, Massachusetts, then they would have to leave Falmouth, Massachusetts, not just for a vacation or a temporary relocation, but permanently. They would have to disappear completely, leaving behind everything they had ever known and starting over somewhere new, somewhere safe, somewhere that Melvin Rain couldn't find them. But leaving meant more than just packing their belongings and driving away. It meant abandoning their identities, their history, their connections to the community where they had lived their entire lives. It meant the children would have to learn to lie about their past, create false stories about why they had moved, and never speak the truth about what had happened to their father. Most importantly, it meant that John Busby would have to make a choice. He could stay and pursue the violent revenge that was consuming his thoughts, or he could prioritize his family's safety and disappear with them into whatever new life awaited them far from Cape Cod. The decision would define not just the next chapter of their story, but the rest of their lives. In the end, the choice was made for them. The town of Falmouth, faced with mounting security costs and no resolution in sight, made it clear that the easiest solution was for the Busby family to simply disappear, rather than continue the expensive protection detail or pursue justice against the person responsible. It was more convenient for everyone involved if the victims just went away. The message was unmistakable. It's easier for you to live somewhere else than to live here. We'll save money, and you'll be on your way. After everything John had sacrificed in service to his community, after taking a shotgun blast to the face in the line of duty, this was his reward. The town that he had protected was essentially telling him that his family's safety was less important than their budget. So in the summer of 1980, almost exactly 1 year after the shooting, the Busby family began their exodus from Cape Cod. They loaded their belongings into a car and started driving south, with no clear destination except somewhere safe. They had pulled the names of towns out of a hat, places where Polly might find work as a nurse, and Tennessee had won the lottery of their desperation. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. They were given a police escort to the Bourne Bridge, the boundary that separates Cape Cod from the mainland. It was both a gesture of respect and a clear message, goodbye and good riddance. You're not our problem anymore. As they crossed that bridge, leaving behind everything they had ever known, the children understood that they weren't just moving to a new town. They were entering a witness protection program of their own design, one where they would have to reinvent themselves completely. The people they had been, the Busby family of Falmouth, Massachusetts, were disappearing forever. The drive south felt like descending into hell. As they traveled further from the familiar coastline of Cape Cod, the temperature rose and the landscape became increasingly foreign. For children who had grown up with ocean breezes and familiar neighborhoods, the rural expanses of the American South felt like exile to another planet. When they finally reached their destination in Tennessee, the culture shock was immediate and overwhelming. Everything was different. The accents, the food, the social customs, even the way people looked at strangers. The Busby children, with their New England sensibilities and traumatic baggage, stood out like beacons in their new community. But standing out was exactly what they couldn't afford to do. So they began the painful process of transformation. Silyn got a perm and started practicing a Southern accent. She learned to apply lip gloss and dress like the local girls. Most importantly, she learned to lie about their past, about why they had moved, about what was wrong with her father's face, about everything that mattered. John grew a massive beard that obscured most of the damage to his face. He found work on a farm, spending his days splitting wood and doing physical labor that seemed to help process some of his rage. The repetitive motion of swinging an axe through logs became a form of therapy, a way to channel the violence that still simmered inside him. For a while, it seemed like the healing might actually work. The family began to find their rhythm in this new place. The constant fear that had defined their existence in Massachusetts gradually faded. The children started making friends. Polly found work as a nurse. They were still looking over their shoulders, still careful about who they trusted. But life began to feel somewhat normal again. But John's anger hadn't disappeared. It had just gone underground. Every few months, he would have to return to Boston for reconstructive surgery, and each trip forced him to confront what had been done to him. When he shaved his beard for these procedures, he would see the full extent of his injuries in the mirror, and the rage would come flooding back. During one of these trips, his uncle presented him with a gift, a rifle with a scope and a silencer, everything he would need to hunt down Melvin Rain and finish what had been started that night in 1979. For a moment, John was tempted. The weapon represented everything he had dreamed about during those dark months of recovery. But something had changed. The man who had once fantasized about revenge had been replaced by someone who understood that his family's peace was worth more than his personal vengeance. He looked at the gun, wrote a note to his uncle, and walked away. "Thank you for your effort," he wrote. "I won't need it." That decision marked a turning point. When John returned to Tennessee, he told his family he was done with surgery, done with trips to Boston, done with living in the past. They were going to embrace their new life and move forward as the people they had become, not the people they used to be. Years passed. The children grew up, went to college, started families of their own. The trauma never fully disappeared, but it became manageable. The family had survived not just the original attack, but the year of terror that followed and the complete upheaval of their lives. Then, in 2003, 24 years after the shooting, something unexpected happened. The Rain family had started turning on each other, fighting over money and spilling family secrets to the police. John Rain, Melvin's brother, finally came clean about what had happened that night in August 1979. The confession provided the vindication that John Busby had been seeking for more than 2 decades. His instincts had been correct. Melvin Rain had indeed been the one who ordered the hit. John Rain described how his brother had sat in the back seat of their car with a ski mask and a shotgun, waiting for the perfect moment to fire through John's window. But vindication came with a bitter irony. By the time the confession was made, the statute of limitations had expired. No charges could be filed. No justice could be served through the legal system. Melvin Reina would never face trial for attempted murder. In a way, though, justice had been served by other means. Melvin Reina was confined to a state institution, suffering from what was reported to be Pick's disease, a form of dementia that affects the brain. The man who had once terrorized an entire community was now powerless, his mind deteriorating, his capacity for violence neutralized by his own failing health. For the Busby family, the confession brought closure of a different kind. They had built new lives far from Cape Cod, lives that were fuller and richer than what they had left behind. Silen became a successful author, writing books for children and drawing on her experiences to help others understand resilience and survival. John and Polly found peace in their rural Tennessee home, surrounded by the natural beauty that had helped heal their wounds. The year they disappeared had ended, but the people they became in its aftermath had endured. They had proven that survival isn't just about staying alive. It's about finding ways to thrive despite the worst that life can throw at you. They had learned that sometimes running away isn't cowardice. It's the bravest thing you can do to protect the people you love. Looking back, Silen would say that she couldn't imagine being anyone other than who that terrible year had made her. The trauma had touched every part of her life, but it had also given her strength, perspective, and an appreciation for safety and normalcy that most people never develop. She had lived through something that should have destroyed her family, and instead, it had ultimately made them stronger. The Busby family's story is a testament to the power of choosing life over revenge, healing over hatred, and love over fear. They disappeared from one life and created another, proving that sometimes the best way to defeat your enemies is simply to refuse to let them define your future. In the end, they had won, not through violence or legal justice, but through the simple act of surviving and building something beautiful from the ashes of what had been destroyed. The year they disappeared had become the foundation for decades of peace, love, and happiness that followed. And perhaps that's the most powerful victory of all.